Well, good morning and welcome to the new board member training for the Board for Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians and the Board for Barbers and Cosmetology. We're excited that you all have joined the board, and we're excited that you are all willing to come down to Richmond and go through this training. We do hope that it'll be a valuable experience for you to really lay the foundation for the work that you'll be doing and the work that we do here at D4. As just sort of a few introductory announcements, the board meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public. The video of each board member is not required, so we're not actually going to pan the room to get everyone on the video. But we do ask that each board member be audible when speaking. For those that are participating online, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. And it may be helpful to turn on closed captioning as that may assist you. If for whatever reason we lose our broadcast virtually, we will suspend the meeting until we're able to restore that. As a housekeeping item, just to let you know, for if you're here on site, there are restrooms. If you head out the back door there, head to the left, go through the double doors past the lobby and to your left, and you'll see them there on the right-hand side. We will have a break in the morning, but obviously feel free to take care of whatever business you need to. Well, again, thank you for coming this morning. I'd like to go ahead and start by introducing our agency director, Mary Braz-Vaughn. She has been with D4 for, I know it's over 15 years. I probably can't name this.
Closer to 20 now.
And she has held a number of different positions. And probably 2 years ago, the Governor Northam appointed her as director of the agency.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me okay? Projection's not usually a problem. So even though it's been a year now, I still feel like this is an unusual way for us to meet. And obviously none of us know how much longer we will be meeting this way, but we've been extremely fortunate in how we've been able to pivot, or whatever the buzzword is in our COVID times, for being able still to meet safely and do the work that we need to do. So you have a really great morning ahead of you, and really emphasizes the benefit you have from your staff. As you'll learn more later today, the agency is what we refer to as an umbrella agency over several boards. And so we provide that administrative leadership and support to the boards. So obviously, as either practitioners or citizen members, no one expects you in your service to be experts on the Administrative Process Act and other intricacies of due process and regulatory public participation. That's our job. And you are served by folks who are really, really great at the nuts and bolts of that every day. So I do encourage you to lean on staff for that. The guiding principles, I just remind you, obviously, public transparency, public participation, due process, these are the things we live by. Sometimes those things require a balance, because in order to provide appropriate due process, sometimes that means that we aren't providing public participation and transparency at the same time in order to preserve that, in the investigation and the case not being available to the public until it's closed, and you'll learn more about all of those things. So I just wanted to have an opportunity to sit here for the first few minutes and have an opportunity to meet everyone. Thank you for your service. Let you know, obviously, I'm here for anything you might need in terms of questions, but you are really, really well served by Steve and his team, and I think they will get a lot out of this, and we really do appreciate your service, because we know that on what you do every day, and we certainly can't do it without you, and appreciate the time it takes to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Brosman. And the next thing that I wanted to do was to take time for us to get to know each other and do some introductions. So if you will, introduce yourself, your name, your profession or role on the board, as I know we've got some folks that are in specific seats, and we have folks that are in citizen seats as well. And then also, if you would tell us what interested you in serving on the board, or when we get staff working at Newport. And I'll go ahead and start us off, and we can just go, I guess, clockwise around the room. So again, my name is Steve Kirshner. I'm the Executive Director of the Board for Barbers and Cosmetology and the Board for Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians. In the agency, we have a lot of boards, and we'll talk about that in detail a little bit, but we have lots of acronyms. And so the section that I'm the Executive Director over is called the BCHOP section. So if you hear me referencing that throughout the morning, it's BCHOP is Board for Barbers and Cosmetology, Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians. So what interested me in working at the board? It's hard for me to, it's a long story. It's hard for me to narrow it down. After college, I kind of bounced around a couple different jobs and didn't really know what I had a passion for until I got a temporary job during the 2004 presidential election working in a county elections office. And I loved it. I got to do things like voter registration, campaign finance, reviewing candidates' filings, making sure they comply with campaign finance law. As I got to know the job better, I started doing poll worker trainings, and I was in Michigan, and the counties were divided up into townships. The township clerks ran the election, so eventually I started doing trainings for the clerks on how they were supposed to run the election. And I also was the clerk to the county board for commissioners, and got to know, I went to every board meeting, took the minutes, and really got to know how government functioned, and that policy side of things really interested me. And I ended up getting a master's in public administration, and when I was doing that, I found that I really liked administrative law. So I decided I wanted to go to law school, not to become a lawyer, but to learn administrative law, because I thought that might really help me in a career in public service. So I went to law school in Virginia, met my wife here in Virginia, and so after law school, I stayed here, was just looking around for government jobs, wanted to get back into government. And when I saw the opening at Newport and saw what they did, I felt like it was exactly for me. It was the perfect job. It combined public administration side, the legal side. I was applying for what we call adjudication specialist, doing administrative hearings of licensees. So there was a kind of legal side of it and the public policy side of it. I knew it was the right place for me. And fortunately, they hired me, gave me a shot. And that was back in 2012. And I've moved around a little bit in the agency, but never regretted that decision. Really loved it. Joe.
Sure. My name is Joseph Crook. I'm the new Regulatory Operations Administrator here in the BCHOP section. My background has some similarities with Steve. I'm originally from Florida, though. Worked at Florida State University for a while, and went ahead and got my master's degree in interdisciplinary humanities. Tried my hand at teaching for a little bit, explored different topics in teaching, and then decided to go to law school. So came up here to Virginia, went to law school here, was fortunate enough to get on with the state in that I was hired by the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. I worked there for just over 7 years. And in that time, I actually had a really, or developed a really good working relationship with Steve, in that my role at Chef was to certify the private post-secondary schools and programs that were operating in Virginia. And there's quite a bit of overlap in what's required by the barber and cosmetology schools, as well as any type of program that is offered by a post-secondary school. So, the schools have to abide by everything that's required by DPOR, and the schools have to abide by everything that's required by Chev. And so, we were always working together. When I saw that there was this opening for the regulatory operations administrator, I jumped at the chance to apply for that because I do like diving down into the minutia of regulatory code and things like that. And then, so we interviewed for that. Then there was a pandemic. And about a year later, the governor allowed, I guess, DPOR to make me an offer. So I was able to seize the moment. And,
Yeah, the timing could not have been worse. The hiring freeze went into effect right after.
So I've been here for about 4 months now. Every day I'm learning something new. So it takes me probably twice as long as it should to make sure I'm getting the right answer. But so far, I love the team that I'm working with, and it's been great. So thanks.
Smith.
My name is Pamela Smith. I'm new to the board, and I am a regional sales manager for South Atlantic. I oversee Virginia and Maryland. I have held my license as a hearing aid specialist for about 15 years in Virginia. Also have a master's degree in business. I decided to become a member on the board because, obviously I'm a sales manager. I do a lot of hiring, so I do a lot of work with DPR on the back end as far as getting people their license and helping, make sure we're staying in compliance with the rules and regulations. So that's pretty much about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Where do you live?
I live in Tidewater.
Okay. Just curious.
Eric Behan, also new board member. Currently help manage my family's optical business. Doing pretty well with that. Been in operation for just over 30 years now. Prior to that, I was still in this industry. I started when I was about 14, so but that's about it.
After all, I'm from April, Virginia. I'm a town manager in Charlottesville. I've been in optics 30 years plus now. Really wanted to be a part of this board, just to help regulations and our profession grow, as an optician and just as a professional. I think there's lots of ways that we can help, and the only way we can do that is get involved.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Young. I'm an optician member for the hearing aid specialists and opticians. I joined the board because I really enjoy, kind of like Joe over there, I like nuts and bolts. I like to know why things are the way they are, and I like to affect change. And I thought this was a really good way to do that. Oh, I live in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Green, and I am at Reynolds Community College here in Richmond. I am an optician by profession, and currently the association with health professionals. So I assist in overseeing the optician program at this point. And
much gotten involved in every aspect of the profession that I could, and I jumped at the opportunity to get involved in new areas. The regulatory side of it is something that I haven't intimately been involved with yet. So when the opportunity, when I was asked by my peers if I could be nominated, they would accept the nomination. I said absolutely, I'd be happy to. So I was actually thrilled to see that I was selected, and this is going to be a really great learning experience because even though oftentimes people would come to me with questions about what our regulatory process is, and I try to assist them. There's nothing like getting into it and learning so that you make sure that you're providing the right information. And so being at college as well puts us in a position where folks assume we know, and that's not the case, right? Assumptions can be wrong. So I'm just excited to learn and be part of the process and hopefully have an impact as well.
Hey, I'm Bo Machado. I'm a representative in now. I have worked from county government to the House. Now I work for public engagement. I am so it's great to be I was super interested at the regulatory piece and also the small business piece that Cosmetology will play throughout the Commonwealth. So when I was asked to serve as a citizen member, I was excited about it, and then talking to Steve was also too. So I'm excited to be a part of it. I think the question is canceled pandemic too, but it is not.
Mary, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
It's a great group. I think you all are bring a lot to the boards, and I'm such a dork. I mean, just like as Steve said, I've been here now almost 20 years, and prior to that, I worked policy for a member of the legislature, and I did not necessarily think that I would stay here for years, but when you're 20s, you understand. I think you're good. That seems like a really long time, right? But I really, enjoy the policy end of things and the regulatory end of things, but the people here are what really, make you stay somewhere for 20 years, right? And a lot of that is also the board members. And I think that I'm excited to meet you all. I'm excited that, as you all start to learn things about it, it reminds me of why I've enjoyed this so much. So again, thank you. I'm not going to be able to stay, but I know that you'll get a lot out of this, and I look forward to working with all of this.
That's great. All right, well, we will jump into our first training then, the regulatory board overview. And I'll just, as we're hold on, I guess we already have it pulled up, but I'll go ahead and comment that this reading was being a little modest, saying that she hadn't really been involved in the board aspect of things because a few years ago, I got to know her. She was serving as a citizen member on a optician subcommittee that was making significant changes to the optician apprenticeship. She was a key part of that committee. Helped us, I think, successfully that apprenticeship from a 2-year to 2-year apprenticeship. You've got more experience than I think many board members will get working through that. We had a lot of meetings. All right, so we're going to start out with this regulatory board overview. And you go ahead. We'll start with just talking about DPOR and who is or what is DPOR. So we are an executive branch agency. Currently, we are under the Office of the Chief Workforce Advisor. Now, there has been this year, the legislature created a new Secretary of Labor, and we are going to move under the Secretary of Labor on July 1, along with a few other state agencies. So for most of us, by the time that we have the next meeting, we'll be under the Secretary of Labor. But ultimately, we are that executive branch agency. So at the end of the day, as D4 employees, our boss is the government. And through the secretary and through the agency director. We have 20 regulatory boards. And so here we've got 2 of our boards. They range from, our biggest ones are board for contractors and the real estate board. And then we have some very small boards, including we regulate professional and amateur wrestlers. So if you want to go see an MMA fight, they've got to be licensed by us. We regulate, actually our oldest profession is branch pilots. If you're not familiar with what a branch pilot is, we started regulating them in the 1640s. And they are water navigators. What they essentially do is any ocean-going ship that enters Virginia waterways has to be piloted by a licensee of that board, by a branch pilot. And they have essentially learned all of the navigable waterways in Virginia and can steer those giant ocean freighters safely to where they're going to. It's a very interesting profession. They actually will get on speedboats. You get a call at 1 a.m. Hey, we need a branch pilot. They drive down to the dock, get on a speedboat, and they are sped up to the ship, jump out, climb up a ladder on that side of the ship to get in there and pilot. So we've got a pretty big diversity of boards. And obviously, we've got board for Barbers and Cosmetology and as we delve into those particular boards, I think you'll see that even within a board itself, there's a huge diversity of kinds of entities and people that we license. So the boards themselves are comprised of practitioners as well as citizens. And the board members are all appointed by the governor to serve either a full 4-year term, all the terms of 4 years for the boards here in Newport. Sometimes you'll be appointed to serve a partial term. If someone has left halfway through their term, you might be appointed to go the rest of the year. All of the board appointments have to be confirmed by the General Assembly. So if you haven't already been, I know that you have been, next year, maybe if your name will go to the General Assembly. Don't worry about it. General Assembly usually doesn't say no to board members. So DPOR has over 200 employees. We have 300,000 licensees. That's individual practitioners as well as businesses. And we have several hundred license types. Just to give you an example, in the Board for Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians, there are 3 license types. Just 3: the optician license, the hearing aid specialist license, and the hearing aid specialist temporary permit. So, 1-year training. The Board for Barbers and Cosmetology has over 35 different licenses. A pretty big contrast there, which we'll explain in more detail. All right, so what types of activities is DPOR involved in? Well, obviously we are issuing licenses, but we're interacting with the public in a lot of different ways. So this is a couple years old, but I think this is from 2018. We had almost 120,000 online transactions, over 400,000 phone calls, 268,000 rules or statements, 100,000 emails. I can tell you, our email, since this slide was created, our email volume is more than double. So we're probably closer to in the 300,000 emails range now. 50,000 applications, 50,000 name and address changes, and we're interacting with the public in a lot of different ways as well. So we're interacting with them online, in board meetings, Facebook, YouTube, public hearings, news outlets, our website, presentations like this. Some of the boards go out and regularly do presentations. Pre-pandemic would go out and just have sort of town hall type events. And then the regulatory town hall. And we'll spend some time talking about the regulatory town hall because there's a lot of business for the boards that are conducted on the regulatory town hall. And that's a website that's maintained by the Division of Legislative Services, I believe. All right, go ahead. All right, so how is DPOR itself structured? Now, we have, of course, the director who is an appointee of the governor. And then below the director, we've broken into a couple different sections within the agency. We have the compliance and investigation folks. And within that section, so we have basically a complaint intake section. We call them the complaint analysis and resolution section. They do the initial vetting on a complaint. Is this a regulatory issue? Is this something that we have legal jurisdiction over? And if we do, and there is a regulatory issue involved, it goes to the next section, the investigation section. We will actually have investigators go out and look into the issue. If there is, in fact, after the investigation, simple grounds to believe that there is a violation, then it'll go to the adjudication section, which is where I started in the agency for a disciplinary hearing. Some other sections that are involved in the compliance investigations, we have an alternative dispute resolution section. So there are times, not so much with these boards, but with real estate and contractors pretty frequently, where the licensee and the complainant sit down together and kind of work out the issue. And so we do have an alternative dispute resolution section to do that. We also have the Common Interest Community Ombudsman, which is a statutory position. Does anybody live in the common interest community or have that subdivision? You've got that board that kind of oversees the subdivision. So they are sort of lightly regulated by the state. There's actually sort of very little authority the state exercise over those entities. But the legislature created an ombudsman you can call and complain to. She can tell you about sort of what your legal rights are. Unfortunately, there's not a lot that she can do to fix situations. She spends a lot of time complaints that she can solve. But that position does exist. The next section in the agency is the communication and board operations section. That's where all of the board sections, so board staff such as myself, Joe, and the BCHOP team, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, we're all in that section. So we're doing the day-to-day administrative activities, issuing licenses, implementing programmatic changes, responding to questions from the public and licensees. We also have legislative affairs, media relations, information management, examinations, and our IT folks. We do have a couple of the other sections. We have administrative support. So one thing that you're probably gathering is that we don't, the board section does not do all the work. So the hearing aid specialist and optician, I don't sit down and do the budget. I don't investigate complaints. That's the agency as a whole does that for all the boards as a whole. So the advantage to that is we can do some cost sharing and balance things out, and we'll see a little bit why that's important to look at the budgets. But essentially, almost all of our services that are commonly needed by each board, regulatory board, will have its own section. So we do have a financial services section that handles all of our accounting, all of our payment processes, etc. We've got administrative services, so one section that rents the space for us and provides us with all the supplies we've got human resources, information technology, and the Virginia Fair Housing Office is a unique entity that is kind of housed here with the board. They're actually a joint federal and state agency. It's kind of unique in that way, but they kind of work hand in hand with the real estate board. They don't really have a way to discipline anyone. So what they do is they'll investigate a case, apply federal law, and go to the real estate board if they're a licensee and say your licensee has violated housing laws. So it's kind of it's a very unique situation, but that's here at Newport as well. All right, so our budgets here. I tried to bold the budgets, but it's not showing up great. For Barbers and Cosmetology, this is our last biennium that ended months ago. We had 6.7 million in revenue, 7.6 million in expenditures. For the hearing aid specialists and opticians, we had 230,000 revenue, 290,000 in expenditures. Why the big gap? You can see in the Radiant population over here, Barber Cosmo has 74,000 licensees. Hazop board has 2,600. So there's about 1,900 opticians and 700. This is why it's important that we do some sharing across the agency. Because if, for example, if the hearing aid specialist and optician board had to staff its own investigators, its own finance folks, its own IT department, wouldn't be able to operate in the black without significant fee increase. The licensee have to pay $500–600 for a license. That $100-ish that they have to pay. So, what is the purpose of the board? Why does the board exist? That question is answered in the Code of Virginia, in the very first section of the chapter that creates all of these regulatory boards and departments. It states that entry into professions is a right, and that it can only be limited the least intrusive way necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So, the least burdensome and most efficient manner are the ways that you can limit entry and regulate these populations. The goal is, again, the health, safety, and welfare of the public. That's the goal of all of the things that ultimately you're going to do as a board member, protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public in the least restrictive way possible. The board does not exist to enhance professional stature or to limit competition. That's the quickest way that you can get sued as a board, is to try to limit competition. And we'll talk about a little bit later, pretty famous, at least in public administration circles, court case about 5 years ago now against the North Carolina Board of Dentistry that was trying to limit competition, got sued by the Federal Trade Commission. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you can be liable individually. So we'll get into that and how to avoid being individually liable for Federal Trade Commission violations in a little bit. So what are we doing? How do we go about this protecting the public in the least restrictive means? Well, we issue licenses, certifications, and registrations, ensuring minimum competency necessary to practice without harming the public. This is the kind of the key word that we're going to keep in our minds: minimum competency. One way to think about it is with the driver's license, right? When you get driver's license test, they're not testing to see that you're a good driver. In fact, I would venture to say none of us were good drivers when we got our driver's license, but we were minimally competent. We could operate and be safe. So that's what we're looking for. That's what we're testing for. Test, that minimum competency. Can you do this in a way that you know how to not hurt people. The board is going to be determining the minimum standards necessary to enter into the profession. So you have the statutory authority to put in place education requirements, examination requirements, and experience requirements. You don't have to do all three of those. Most of the time, we just have education and examination. Some professions also have experience requirements, or have experience in lieu of education. Some professions. Almost every profession at D4 requires an exam. We were recently given the responsibility by the legislature of regulating professional sport athlete agents. So the Jerry Maguires of the world, if you're going to operate in Virginia, have to get a license class. That's actually not a regulatory board. It's the director that oversees that program. They don't have an exam. They just have to take it. So the next thing that we're doing is enforcing the standards of professional conduct. So I think that most of you are aware that in the board's regulations, once you get that license, there are some things that you have to do as a licensee. So the agency exists to enforce, part of what we do is enforcing those professional conduct. And we do that in a number of different ways, primarily through the disciplinary process, where we can obtain compliance. If somebody is doing something the wrong way, we can tell them, no, you have to do it this way, and get compliance that way. Alternatively, we can send them through the disciplinary process where they can be fined, put on probation, have their license suspended, or their license revoked. We'll go through that process much more detail. Why do we do it? Well, we do it because lawmakers have determined that there are risks associated with these professions. There's a risk of public harm. And so the government must be involved to protect the public or society. The regulatory framework and administration provides the consumers with a modest level of protection and assurance that the regulated segment of the economy has some basic level of qualifications, are operating under certain standards. In many ways, this is designed to promote and improve the economy. The public theory behind that is if individuals know that when they come to Virginia and they go to a cosmetology salon, the person working on their hair has been properly trained to use those chemicals, sanitize those chemicals, so I'm not necessarily going to be exposed to infectious disease. When I go there, they will feel confident in going out and patronizing Virginia businesses. It will feel safe. It will make Virginia a safe and welcoming place. That's the basic idea, the economic theory behind this, that we're going to make people feel much more comfortable to engage in the Virginia economy by this regulation. So the beach hop section, we have 13 staff. We've got the executive director. Our administrative assistant is Kathy Clark. And all of you have had some communication with Kathy already. And she does a lot of the administrative part of setting up and running the meetings. So you'll be getting from her before every meeting in the packet with the jump drive, with the that's got the information about the meeting. Any issues that you have with your travel reimbursement, travel reimbursement, that's going to be worked out by Kathy. We have a licensing operations administrator, Mr. Rodriguez, who oversees all of our licensing staff. Joseph Crook is our regulatory operations administrator, and he's doing a lot of reviewing of the regulations, making sure that we are implementing them correctly, responding to questions from the public about how to interpret regulations, and even drafting regulations and putting them through the regulatory process. We're going to talk about that in detail later this morning. We have 10 licensing specialist positions, 9 of which are filled right now. And so this is our team here. Most of our licensing staff are under Tanika. Joe actually does have some. They're unfilled, so that's going to build out here hopefully pretty soon. And they're the ones that are taking all the calls. They're processing the applications. When you submit your renewal, they're working on it. And when you're bringing in temporary permit holders, they're the ones that are processing those applications. Okay, so let's talk about the composition of these boards. And we'll move a little quicker through here. It's all in the Code of Virginia. So the legislature has said there's going to be 10 members of the Board for Barbers and Cosmetology. There's going to be 15 members of the Board for Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians. And the code actually specifies who will make up that board. 2 licensed barbers, 2 licensed cosmetologists, at least one a salon owner, 1 licensed nail technician, or a cosmetologist who specializes in nails. Go ahead. 1 licensed tattoo artist or body piercer, 2 licensed estheticians, and 2 citizen members. That's our Board for Barbers and Cosmetology. These are our current board members. And Mr. Machayo is our citizen member here this morning. We were hoping to have Ms. Smith here as well, although she wasn't able to make it. For the hearing aid specialists and opticians, and we tend to acronym that as HAZOP, Board for Hearing Aid Specialists and Opticians. HAZOP board's got 15 members, 4 licensed hearing aid specialists, at least 1 is an audiologist, 6 licensed opticians, 1 otolaryngologist, 1 ophthalmologist, and 3 citizen members, 1 of whom must be a hearing aid user or has a family member who is. So we've got some additional qualifications for the HAZOP board as far as years of experience. Go ahead. And then this is our current board as well. So we actually have all but 1 of our positions filled right now. So we've got 14 slots filled. So what kind of volume do we have here in our section? We do about 70 emails a day. We have approximately 170 calls a day. We process about 170 license transactions per week. So that's going to be new licenses, renewals, we also process about 25 certifications of licensure per week. What is a certification of licensure? When someone wants to transfer their license to another state, that other state is going to say, well, at Virginia, certify to us that they are current, that they've never been disciplined, what their expiration date is, how did they get the license as far as training and exams. We produce a document that's called certification of licensure, just like we request from the other states. So we do about 25 of those per week. So who should be licensed? We frequently will talk about something, the scope of practice of your license. When do you require a license? How do I know that what I'm doing means I have to be a licensed optician or a licensed barber? All of that is in the Code of Virginia. It's actually going to be in the definitions section report. The thing that a barber is, these are the things that you have to have a license to do. For example, a barber means any person who shaves, shapes, trims the beard, cuts, singes, shampoos, or dyes the hair, or applies and treats or massages the face with various oils that are in connection with those 2 other services. So what is a barber? They can work on the beard, they can work on your hair, and they can apply lotions or massage your face in connection with that. That's what a barber can do. That's what the Code of Virginia says that they can do. Let's go ahead to the next one. And we won't necessarily dive into detail about what the scope is for each of these professions. But I want to illustrate a couple points about these scopes of practices, because people can get really easily tripped up by them. And so let's look at cosmetology. A cosmetologist means any person who administers cosmetic treatments. And what is a cosmetic treatment? It doesn't say There is no definition of cosmetic treatment, so just keep that in the back of your mind. But it's skin, right? Skin care. Manicures or pedicures the nails of any person. Arranges, dresses, curls, waves, cleanses, cuts, shapes, singes, waxes, tweezes, shaves, bleaches, colors, relaxes, straightens, or performs similar work on human hair or wig by any means, etc. And then we've got some language about. All right, so really, when we look at this, we're going to figure out, somebody calls and says, I'm doing X, Y, Z. And if you can go back to cosmetology, I'm doing X, Y, Z. Do I need a cosmetology license to do that? We're going to look at this scope of practice. And we're going to say, all right, well, it's something to the hair. Does it involve arranging, dressing, curling, waving, cleansing, cutting, shaping, singeing, waxing, tweezing, shaving, bleaching, etc.? We've got to figure that out. A few years ago, we had a lot of folks calling us saying, hey, can a cosmetologist do straight razor shaving of a beard? Well, that's a good question. Now, of course, the barber definition said, if you remember, they can shave a beard. What does the cosmetology definition say? Well, it says, what can they do to human hair? It says they can shave or perform similar work upon human hair by any means. Well, straight razor shaving human hair by any means. It is. So this was kind of a radical conclusion because up until probably about 2014, it was understood in the profession. Barbers did straight razor shaving, cosmetologists didn't. So the code says that they can, right? So we went to the office of the Attorney General and said, this is the way we're reading this. Are we right or are we wrong? And they said, no, you're right. It says they can shave hair by any means. That includes, as long as it's the beard is human hair, then they can shave it by any means. And so we started having to tell cosmetologists and barbers who were not happy about it. That's what Virginia said. So there can be kind of unexpected outcomes, but ultimately, this is what the legislature has said. That's what this profession can do. Let's jump back and think about this cosmetic treatments. What are cosmetic treatments? There's no definition of cosmetic treatments. Go ahead forward to the, I think we've got aesthetics in there. Here we go. So, esthetician. What is an esthetician? Aesthetics includes, but is not limited to, the following practices of administering cosmetic treatments to enhance or improve the appearance of the skin. Aha! They're going to list cosmetic treatments. So now we have something in the Code of Virginia that's going to tell us what cosmetic treatments are. Let's look at this sentence. It includes the following practice of administering cosmetic treatments, colon. What's that colon mean? We've got a list now. Everything that comes after that is a list of things that are cosmetic treatments. If you look at the rest of the sentence, and it's going to, I won't necessarily read everything that's in there, but it's essentially various ways that you can enhance or improve the appearance of the skin. Has some commas, has some semicolons, and it doesn't have a period till the very end of the sentence. We didn't copy on it. There is a period in the Code of Virginia. Everything within the scope of practice and aesthetics is a cosmetic treatment. That means that a cosmetologist can do anything within the scope of practice of aesthetics because they can do cosmetic treatment. This is a list of cosmetic treatments. The estheticians didn't mean it to be that way when they had lobbied to have aesthetics regulated about 2 years ago. They wanted it to be a carve-out separate from cosmetology. They gave a bill to some legislatures who made some amendments and passed it. But what they ended up doing, by the way that they wrote this law, is basically just listed a bunch of things that the cosmetologists do. From time to time, the estheticians will actually try to change that, but they haven't been successful so far in the legislature. If you want to go back to tattooing and body piercing, This is another example for tattooing. We do regulate tattoo with the binders under the Board for Barbers and Cosmetology. And what does that mean? Well, it's placing designs, letters, scrolls, etc. upon or under the skin with ink or any other substance resulting in permanent coloration of the skin. This is an interesting one. A lot of people will argue with the board about what is permanent. Well, what I'm doing is the ink that I'm putting in there is going to dissolve after. Well, that's not permanent, right? Well, the reality is, and for those that have tattoos, ink fades, all ink fades. There's no ink that isn't going to fade. There's no such thing as a truly permanent ink that will never go away. So the reality, permanent coloration doesn't mean will never go away, because otherwise there is no tattooing at all that exists in the world. What the reality is permanent, we have to figure out, well, what does that mean? Since there is no truly permanent thing, it's not stone. Well, how about you can't wash it off? You can't wash it off. It's not going to go away immediately on its own. It's permanent. Where that comes into play, if some of you may have heard of permanent cosmetic tattooing, like microblading, permanent makeup. A lot of those things last anywhere between 1 to 2 years. A lot of folks initially said, well, we shouldn't have to get a license because it's not permanent. And our tattooer board members kind of laughed and said, yeah, no ink is permanent. If you can't wash it off, that's really fine. All right, let's jump over to opticians or hearing aid specialists, whichever is next. How does the Code of Virginia define the scope of practice for hearing aid specialists? Well, it actually defines the practice of fitting or dealing in hearing aids, which is the thing that requires a license. Means the measurement of human hearing by the means of an audiometer or by any other means solely for the purpose of making selection, adaptations, or the sale of hearing aids. So measuring the hearing for the purpose of getting a hearing aid, the sale of hearing aids, or the making of impressions for ear molds. That's it. Those 3 things are the things that actually require a license. So measuring human hearing for the selection of hearing aids, the sale of hearing aids, and making impressions of ear molds. When we run into problems here, a lot of folks think that they can hire a receptionist or cash register. That's selling a hearing aid, and you have to have a hearing aid specialist license for that. Making impressions for ear molds are the same thing. So what's interesting is in the training, the required training for hearing aid specialists, there's a whole lot of stuff that falls outside of those 3 items that you really have to know in order to do these things competently. So there are some ancillary things that the board's going to require folks to learn, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a license to do those ancillary things. The licensure is required for those 3 things. Go ahead. So opticians, their definition has a lot of sort of, not really adjectives, but they have a lot of descriptors of different types of things, all revolving around glasses or services. So an optician is somebody who prepares or dispenses eyeglasses, spectacles, lenses, or other related apertures appurtenances. I'm gonna get in trouble here. For the intended wearers or users on prescriptions from licensed physicians or licensed optometrists, or as duplications or reproductions of previously paired eyeglasses, spectacles, lenses, related appurtenances, who, or in accordance with such prescriptions, duplications, or reproductions, measures, adapts, fits, and adjusts eyeglasses, etc. So all of that to say, we're preparing glasses and lenses based on prescriptions that were created by someone who is authorized by law to make those. The optician's definition is actually, so maybe it's lengthy, but it's actually really simple. It's one of our simpler definitions, although it's also fairly wordy because you've got to have the different things, glasses, spectacles, etc. All right, so the Code of Virginia says that all of these people that are doing things within these scopes of practice have to hold a license. We also have to, for businesses in the barber cosmetic field, that where cosmetology or barbering or anything within the scope of practice is performed, they also have to have a facility license. Schools in the Barber Cosmo world, if you're teaching the Barber Cosmo program, you have to have a license from the board to do that. But there are exemptions in the code, and I won't necessarily go into all of these, but just so that you're aware, there are exemptions and licensure for different things, depending on which board it is. For Barber Cosmo, persons who practice medicine are exempt from licensure. There's no qualification to that. So that means that if you're licensed to practice surgery, osteopathy, or if you're chiropractic, you're a licensed chiropractor, you don't have to have a license in cosmetology or tattooing or microdermabrasion, and you don't have to have a facility license. The place where you're doing those, you don't have to have it. It's broadly exempted. One of the things that we get questions about, if you want to go to the next one, I think it's on there. Persons licensed as funeral directors or embalmers do not have to have a license. That actually kind of makes sense because they're doing a lot of cosmetic treatments and doing things that address the care of a person. Of course, again, there's no limiting principle. So if they wanted to start doing tattooing and doing these advanced chemical peels and things like that, they could do that through this exemption as well. So the Barber Cosmo field has a number of things. Probably the most prominent exemption is gratuitous services. If you're not getting paid for any service that you're performing, you don't have to have a license. We've had one individual that I know of that couldn't get a license. They didn't want to go through the training program. They were licensed in another state, but it wasn't an equivalent training. They would have to redo their training to get licensed as a cosmetologist. They didn't want to do that. But they said, well, can I just open a salon, not charge anyone, but sell product at whatever price I want? He said, well, yeah, we don't regulate the sale of products. We regulate the service. You're not charging them. You're not requiring them to purchase the product. Yeah, you can do that. And sure enough, she did it. She opened a salon. And I know that she did it because about 4 months later, we got a complaint at the court for unlicensed activity, that this person was doing cosmetology without a license. We ultimately closed the complaint because I had no evidence that she was actually charging or receiving tips for the service she was performing. All right, let's go to the HAZOP exemptions. So again, they've got, you can keep going. They've got the general requirements if you're going to engage in opticianry or fitting or dispensing, fitting or selling hearing aids, you have to have a license. And then we've got some exemptions. For the opticians, any licensed physician or a licensed optometrist does not need a license. That's going to be different than hearing aid specialists. For the hearing aid specialist, the exemption says a licensed physician who's certified by the American Board of Otolaryngology, something like that. They don't have to take the exam, but they still do have to get a license. So anybody that's fitting or dealing in hearing aids actually has to be licensed by us, regardless of your other qualifications. But for opticians, physicians are exempted. The other sort of big exemption for opticians, and this is a pretty big exemption, drives a pretty big truck through it. Any person who does not hold himself out to the public as an optician and who works exclusively under the direct supervision and control of the physician or optometrist or optician in the same location doesn't have to have a license. So if you have a licensed optician or optometrist on site, you can have someone doing optician as long as they're not holding themselves out as an optician. If they've got a name card that says optician and they're not, that's a problem. If they have a name card that says something else and they're working under the control and supervision of one of these folks, they don't have to have a license. We have one unique exemption in the Code of Virginia for opticians. And maybe you can enlighten me, because I don't know the history of this exemption, but I'll describe it to you. An optician who does not regularly practice in Virginia, holds a current valid license in another state, volunteers to provide free health care to an underserved area in the Commonwealth under the auspices of a publicly supported, all-volunteer nonprofit with no paid employees that will sponsor the provision of the health care to this group. Keep going. We've got more. Files a copy of the out-of-state license with us, notifies the board within 15 days prior to the voluntary provisions, and acknowledges in writing that such license or exemption shall only be valid during the limited period in which the free health care is available through the volunteer nonprofit organizations. That's a really specific exemption. It's got to be someone who's licensed in another state, working for an all-volunteer nonprofit with no paid employees to do healthcare in an underserved area. I have no idea where that came from, but I'm very curious to know the specific situation that led to this exemption. Let's keep going. So hearing aid specialist again, the exemptions, physicians who are licensed to practice and certified by the American Board of Otolaryngology will not have to pass the exam. We recently had an additional exemption added that individuals with doctorates in audiology also do not have to take the exam to get the license. But an audiologist still has to have the license. And many audiologists only have a master's. They do have to take it. Nothing in this chapter shall prohibit any person who does not sell hearing aids or accessories, or who is not employed by an organization that sells hearing aids, from engaging in the practice of measuring human hearing for the purposes of selection. So, if you are not actually selling the hearing aids, then you can measure the human hearing for the purpose of selecting the hearing aids. So that's kind of the nonprofit type situation. You're providing a service. Hey, you need hearing aids. We'll measure your hearing for you. Take these measurements, go get a hearing aid. We're not going to sell to you. You don't need a license. The other thing that's listed in the exemptions, you don't have to go back. Businesses that operate, that employ hearing aid specialists don't have to have business licenses as any particular thing with us. So we have a way to report licensees. So if you've got somebody that's either practicing without a license or is violating the regulations, we have a mechanism to report that complaint to us. It'll be reviewed by our complaint intake section, and we'll talk about that process much more in detail. The Code of Virginia actually says that the agency needs a complaint in writing in order for us to investigate it. So when you contact us to file a complaint, people call, well, we have to submit it to us in writing. Some folks don't want to do that. We will accept anonymous complaints, and I've told many person that, look, create an anonymous email account, anonymous@gmail.com, and email the board. If you just mail in a complaint anonymously, it's actually really difficult for the board or for the board to work that case, because generally speaking, we might have some follow-up questions. It's not clear if a regulation has been violated. And there's no way for us to ask for more detail if it's just mailed in. If you have an anonymous email address, we can email you back and say, hey, you know, photos, can you tell us exactly what they did? Did you actually see money exchange? You know, that kind of thing. And that assists us. DPOR and its regulatory boards cannot require any individual or business to refund money, to correct deficiencies, provide other personal remedies. So if somebody files a complaint, barber butchered my hair, we can't force the barber to fix your hair. We can't force the barber to give you your money back. The only things we can do is fine the barber, we can suspend their license, or we can revoke it. Those are the options that the Board for Barbers and Cosmetology has. D4 also cannot provide legal advice. This is something that people constantly call us with these questions that really are kind of a legal advice question. So people will say, hey, do I need a license to do procedure? What we can say is, if the procedure falls within the scope of practice, then yes, you do. Well, yeah, but do I need a license? That's a legal question. Whether, you need to talk to an attorney about whether I can't tell you to do a license. I can tell you that if you're doing X, Y, Z. We operate in view of the public. Obviously, we're subject to FOIA. Everything that you do in connection with the board. So if you're emailing happy with a question, that's a FOIA-able email. All of our correspondence internally is FOIA-able. Any emails, any letters that we write. There are a few exemptions from FOIA, things like disciplinary cases. While the disciplinary case is active, it's not subject to FOIA. But all of our board meetings are open to the public. They have to be announced in advance. Generally speaking, if we have a business item on the agenda, then there will be a public comment period. This training is kind of the only meeting that we do where there aren't business items. That's why we didn't have a public comment period. Of course, when we post the minutes of the meetings online as well, the recording of this meeting will be posted online. If the meeting is not virtual, we don't record it online. All right, any questions? Okay, well, we will then jump into the next presentation, which is the board member roles and responsibilities. I think we're going to go pretty quickly through this one because, if I remember correctly, this is the one that was provided to you in your board member packet. Which one are we doing? That's the bottom one, roles and responsibilities. Thanks, John. Okay, so we'll go through this, and I just want to kind of emphasize, hit on a couple of key points from this presentation. Again, the purpose of the board is to protect the public by establishing entry requirements that ensure minimum competence, develop standards of conduct and practice for maintaining licenses and certificates, and then taking disciplinary action for the regulatory violation. We're going to talk about this in much more detail, but ultimately, anyone that's disciplined by the board or by the agency, the board has to approve that. Agency staff do not have the authority to impose any kind of penalty on the licensee. We also don't have the authority to deny a license. The board can deny a license. So that's one of the key aspects of your position here. The purpose of the board is not to limit entry into the profession or impose overly burdensome requirements. So what is an overly burdensome requirement? This is more of an art than a science to answer that question. We're going to go into detail in a little while about the regulatory process, how to actually create rules in the regulatory process. But many of the steps in that process are your proposed rule is going to be reviewed by several state agencies. It's going to be reviewed by the Office of the Attorney General. Make sure you have the legal authority to do what you're doing. Then it's going to be reviewed by the Department of Planning and Budget. They are going to look at the economic impact of what you're doing. They're going to ask us, board staff, a million questions about the true need and the economic impact of any change that we're doing. So, for example, we recently filed a proposed change to the hearing aid specialist training. And essentially what it did is create an apprenticeship program to add a new method of getting the license. It wouldn't change the old one. It just adds a new one. As a registered apprenticeship, similar to what opticians have or cosmetologists and barbers. And then there was also a small change to the temporary permit. They were going to, right now, the temporary permit, the learning permit for hearing aid specialists is 12 months with an optional 6 months. You can only get if you haven't finished your training. The board is going to modify that so that it's just an 18-month permit. And it's also going to say, but you can't take the exam until you're 9 months into your training. And the reason for that is because our pass rate on the hearing aid specialist is well under 50%. When we looked at it, the folks that are taking the exam with less than 9 months have like a 36% pass rate. For those less than 6 months, it's a 20% pass rate. It's like a 9% pass rate over 3 months of training. So the board had just those 3 changes. Permit is now 18 months instead of 12. You can't test until 9 months in, and a new training option. DPB sent me an email the other day, 20 questions, different than the way I do that with my kids, where it's yes and no. These were not yes and no. These were, you're going to have to justify trainings. We want to know exactly the impact financially for these folks that are now going to wait 9 months. We want to know how did you get your data? Can you justify it? So I ended up having to provide almost 3,000 word response to the 20 questions that they had. And that was for what I would call really simple regulation. They're going to send me I had 1 year, it was right at Christmas, actually. It was the week of Christmas. They sent me over 100 questions related to regulation that I spent probably 80 hours for responding to. So we have to be able to justify and prove that they're not overly burdensome, that they are, in fact, necessary to ensure minimum competency for protecting health, safety, and welfare, and that there are no less restrictive ways to do it. They will, they're going to ask specifically, what other less restrictive ways did the board consider? What was their analysis? Why did they choose not to enact these other ideas? Did they consider this? Did they consider that? Was this less restrictive? When they're done with that, they're going to issue an economic analysis that's going to go to the governor, where they're going to say, this is what they said. This is what we think the economic impact will be. It's going to affect wages like this. It's going to affect the economy like this. We agree with, the agency responded with this. We agree with them, or we disagree with them. We think they need to pull this. The governor tends to listen to them over us. We have a chance to kind of make our case and do a rebuttal, but it's not always successful with the governor. Then it's going to go to the secretary and the governor to come back to the board. So what is overly burdensome? We as staff, try to have very detailed conversations before flush this out, make sure we've got our ducks in a row, so that when DPB asks us, did you consider this? Did you consider this? Prove this is necessary to protect the health and welfare of the public. We have to have strong, solid answers to that. So we'll try to have those discussions first, rather than, I don't know, we didn't talk about that. Well, take it back to the board and talk about it. So go ahead. Board's authority. What authority do you have as a board member? Sorry to bring bad news. You don't have any authority as a board member. The board as a whole has authority. So there's, as a individual member, the board chair can't make any decisions for the board. You can't make any decisions for the board. I can't make any decisions for the board. Only the full board makes decisions. So as a member of the public body, as a board member, you do have some things you have to be aware of. The Conflict of Interest Act, you should have received information about that. I understand the link maybe wasn't working to that. We'll get to the right link. I do apologize about that. There is an annual conflict of interest training that you have And that's essentially, the biggest thing you're looking for is any kind of financial interest that you might have in the outcome of a board decision. A couple of things that we've seen where this comes into play. We have had board members file a complaint against a competitor. And it was a legitimate complaint, and it made it to the board. Well, if they filed the complaint, one, they need to recuse themselves because they were the ones that filed the complaint. But we've had folks that say, I know the person that filed the complaint. They filed it against my competitor, and honestly, they lose their license. I'm going to and they recuse themselves. Another situation that we had quite a few years ago is we had some folks that were trying to get some board members that were trying to get the agency to hire a company. They received had a pecuniary interest. And so that was something that would have to be disclosed if you're trying to get the board to take an action that would benefit a company that you're involved in, an organization you're involved with. You have to disclose that. There may be times where you have to recuse yourself. The next area of the law that applies to you, Freedom of Information Act. Talked about that. Kind of in more detail, what does that mean? Email about your business is subject to FOIA. If you email each other, it can be subject to FOIA if it's about your business. And another thing that happens inside the, it's not in the Freedom of Information Act, but anytime that 3 or more board members are together, they're in person or virtual, and discussing board business, that's a meeting. If you're talking about board business, so let's say if you're at a social gathering and the 4 of you run into each other and say, hey, remember that case that came up at the board the other day? You are now conducting a board meeting under the law, which has to be publicly noticed, which is subject to FOIA requirements, has to have a public comment period, etc. You can land in some big trouble doing that. Now, that's at 3 or more. If you run into one other board member, there you could talk about board business. I wouldn't necessarily advise it. But generally speaking, and of course you can interact with other board members in groups, but you can't talk about the board that situation. So you'll find that what we do when we send out mass communications to board members, we blind copy all the board members. If we just put everybody in there and you start to reply all, that's an electronic meeting. Now we've got some problems. So we blind copy you so that when you reply, you're not inadvertently starting the board meeting. You're just replying to us. And you can email us. We don't count. It's not a meeting on us or the staff or anything like that. The Administrative Process Act is going to govern how you go about creating regulations and how you go about disciplining licensees. We're going to get into that in detail later on. And then the other section is Title 54.1. That's where B4 is created. It's where your board is created. There's a number of provisions that impact you as board members there as well. You will have to file an annual statement of economic interest. At each meeting or IFAC, you will have to recuse yourself if it's appropriate or disclose any potential conflicts. You'll actually get a form at the meeting. It's a disclosure form. You have to check a box that says, I don't have any conflicts, or I do, and this is the conflict. Something that's really kind of important here, during votes at the board meeting, we're going to ask for yays and nays, and from time to time people want to abstain. The only time it's appropriate to abstain is if you have a conflict. What will happen is if you vote to abstain, staff will ask you, what is the reason you're going to abstain? And there will need to be a conflict such as this. If you just can't side or you don't want to take sides, that's not really the purpose of abstaining. That's not an appropriate abstention. You will have to vote yes or no on the item. All right, we can keep going. So our meetings, the minutes, they're all public records and subject to disclosure. One thing that you'll find, the agenda packet that we send you, we are going to post on the website. All the memos, the financial documents, it all goes public except for this information. That is not subject to FOIA. That is confidential information. So if you get a case in your agenda packet, or if you're Barbara Cosmo, you're going to get 50 cases in your agenda packet. That's private information that shouldn't be disclosed. That's why we password protect the agendas. I think we've talked about that. There are times when the board will be going into closed session, and that is generally to discuss their specific statutory reasons we go into closed sessions to discuss legal advice, exam issues. That says deliberate in disciplinary cases. The deliberation itself usually is not subject to FOIA, or subject to the closed session. Where it could come into play is if you wanted to negotiate something different than was publicly noticed, specifically like with consent. If you have a consent agreement where someone says, yeah, I'll admit I did it, but I only want a $200 fine. That comes to you and you say, oh no, we want $2,500 fine. Theory, if you want to negotiate with that person, change the recommendation you would go into the closed session. That's going to be very rare. And we don't need to delve into the details of that, but essentially there's very specific requirements about going into the closed session. We'll have to read a script going into it. Everyone that's not identified with the identified people that must be there, everyone else has to leave. Then there's a way to get out of it, and the board has to vote. And we only discuss the things that we are allowed to discuss. And of course, we post on the website, we have to post the draft minutes within 10 days before you, and the final minutes within 3 days of adoption. So we post the minutes. And again, all of our records are presumed open unless there's a specific reason not to. And if you want, it looks like some folks are kind of ready for a break. You want to pause here, take a break? We can jump back in. No, that's all right, everyone. Okay, all right, yeah, we'll take a break and we'll start back up at 10:45. Or earlier if folks are ready. Any questions that you'll have on things we've talked about so far? I think we'll do that. Which one? I think it's the one with the blue box. Okay, we'll pick up where we left off, talking about exemptions to FOIA, things that we will not disclose publicly. Applications for the exam or licensure. So when somebody actually fills out that application, that's actually never going to be public. Disclose that. Active investigation files, exam questions and answers, pretty obvious reason for that. Any attorney-client communication. So what does that mean? You are the client, the agency, the orders the client. We're communicating with our attorney, which is the Office of the Attorney General. That is protected attorney-client communication. You heard me reference talking to the Office of the Attorney General about and cosmetology communication. That communication is actually attorney-client communication. I can waive the disclosure requirements. So I can tell folks, hey, they told us, yeah, cosmetology communication. I've had folks that say, well, give me the document where they said that. No, it's not. That is protected. You do not have to disclose it. No. So we do frequently get requests for our communication with the AG's office. Closed session information. So anything that happens in closed session, we will not disclose. And governor's working papers, policy items, particularly documents surrounding legislation. We've done some policy analysis for legislation. That's a governor's working paper that will not be disclosed. Typically, you as the board would not be involved in that part of it. So the exemptions, we can't just declare something's confidential. It actually, there has to be a statutory ground. So everything we listed is specifically exempted in the Code of Virginia. Just assume any correspondence is disclosed. The APA, Administrative Process Act, I referenced earlier that this governs how you create regulations and how you discipline someone. Really, as far as the disciplinary stuff, this is what establishes your due process. As a licensee, you are being disciplined. You have your due process rights established within the Code of Virginia. The way that those due process rights work, generally, it's about disclosure. We will tell you if there's an investigation. We'll tell you if there's a hearing. We will invite you to participate, bring counsel, submit evidence to defend yourself. We will tell you when you're going to go to the board, and you will have a chance to talk to the board. They're the ones that are actually going to make the decision. So all of that is actually governed by the Code of Virginia timelines that are set in the Code of Virginia. Talk about our licensing process. We'll talk about it can be pretty lengthy. Get a license, you have to go through a license for 4 to 6 months. Most of that timeline is going through these due process steps. It's the rights that are put in place to protect you so that you can defend yourself. Also, drag your client out of these decisions. It also provides the framework for how we do the regulatory process. For the meetings, we have to have a quorum. In some cases, the quorum of the number of people present in order to conduct business is actually spelled out in the Code of Virginia. Generally speaking, it's a majority of the board. So if you have a 15-member board, a quorum is 8 members. If you have a 10-member board, a quorum is 6. 5 is not a majority, it's exactly 50-50, 6. In order to discipline someone, you need a majority of those qualified to vote. What does it mean to be qualified to vote? Well, what if you're not there? Are you qualified to vote? You are. Qualified to vote means anyone who's appointed to the board. So, for example, Barbara Cosmo, we have a 10-member board. If we have all 10 spots filled, then there are 10 people that are qualified to vote. So we need 6 people to vote in the affirmative. What happens if we have 7 out of 10 show up for a board meeting? We can only lose 1 person in closed discipline. If, well, let me give, I guess we could lose 2. We have to lose 2. If we had 7 out of 10, we still need a majority, which is 6. Let's say 1 board member who showed up is recused. They weren't on this. Now you only have 6 people left in the room. All 6 have to vote in affirmative. If you have 5 in affirmative and 1 that votes against it, that motion fails. You can't discipline them. You have to have majority of those qualified. Everyone, majority of the seats that are filled. The way that the voting works, the board operates by motion. So there'll be someone who makes a motion, makes a second, then there'll be discussion. The chairman of the board gets the vote. They can participate in discussions. If the board member abstains, they have to give the reason. If a board member is silent during the vote, the minutes will record that member's vote as a yes. Public comment. We do give people a chance to speak to the board. If they are there for a case, they will be given time before their case is called, or once the case is called, to talk to the board. They're going to have 5 minutes. If you want to talk to the board about something that's not a case, you're going to talk during public comment. You'll be given 5 minutes right at the beginning of the meeting to talk to the board. Generally speaking, Barbara Cosmo pre-COVID would have 3 to 5 public commenters to talk about policy issues. Hearing aid specialists and opticians usually no. There are sometimes folks will come. We had the Optician Association of Virginia have actually reached out to us about talking to the board. We just gave them a slot on the agenda. In theory, they spoke during public comment. But the board typically, when you've got big industry associations, we as staff try to give the associations time to actually talk to the board outside of that 5 minutes. Disciplinary cases. If someone wants to speak during a meeting about their case, they can, anyone who participated in disciplinary hearing talk about the case. If they didn't participate in the disciplinary hearing, called an IFF or informal fact-finding conference, they can't speak. Limited to 5 minutes, each person gets 5 minutes. They cannot provide additional evidence. So they might show up, they might have gotten a summary recommendation from a presiding officer that said, revoke the license, here's why. And they might disagree, and they might realize, oh, you know what? I forgot to tell the hearing officer about this thing. It totally justifies what I did. They can't tell you about it. And if they start to, we as staff will have read the transcript, hopefully you've read the transcript as well. We're going to stop them and say, you cannot provide anything evidence. The only thing you can talk about is whether you agree with the recommendation, why you agree. You as board members, let's say if you've had a situation that comes up, someone says, no, I have this new evidence that totally change the outcome of this. You can say, we're going to send this back to another evidence. Then it will come back to us. So it's very important that you have read the agenda. With the HAZOP agenda, it's not usually cases, or a lot of cases. There might be 1 or 2 cases. And the case file is going to consist of the summary and recommendation of the hearing, whether that's a licensing hearing or disciplinary hearing, a transcript from that hearing, all the supplemental documentation attached to that. The disciplinary case, you have the investigative record. If it's a licensing case, you might have the applications, documents. For one case, documents will generally be documents, which for HAZOP is pretty manageable. You might have 1 or 2 cases. For Cosmo, you might have 50, 80 cases. So our agendas frequently are 3,000 to 5,000 pages. And for each case, you have each of those sets of documents, as well as the policy. So we want you to come prepared and have read through all those documents. In reality, for every case, you're not necessarily going to look at every single investigative document. You'll definitely want to have read the summary and recommendation, the referral memo or report of findings, if it was investigative case. It's very helpful to read the transcript so you see what the licensee actually said. And then as you read those documents, you're going to sometimes have questions. They said this, they said they gave this document. Did they really, what did the document say? And so there'll be times where you're actually delving in and looking at the record yourself so you can better understand the case. It's not necessarily going to happen every time. And we'll talk with our experienced board member panel, get a sense for how they actually prepare as far as how they look at the case and how much time it takes. So disciplinary cases and application cases, the board should proceed at the meeting as though they have no knowledge of the details of the respondent's case. By that, what we mean is, but I'm sorry, so these are actually quotes from different cases where boards have had items overturned. Their cases, their decision, the board meeting was overturned by a court. And so these are some of the reasons that courts have overturned cases. The board proceeded at the meeting as though they had no knowledge of the details of the respondent's case. What does that look like? Meeting, board member saying, I didn't read the case, can you tell me what this is about? That's actually what happened in that particular case. In the meeting, there were multiple board members who said, oh yeah, no, I didn't look at the case. But they still voted not having looked at the case. Next, the board erred in its final order when they ruled without a full understanding of the record before it. And there are times where someone will state the wrong thing. Well, in the IFF, they said they did do X, Y, Z. In the IFF, they said they did not do X, Y, Z. The board's final order is unlawful because it ruled contrary to the facts before them. Board members ruled without full comprehension of the record. The big thing, administrative law, the thing that will always get a board in trouble, is this phrase right here. They ruled arbitrarily and capriciously. What does that mean? Arbitrary decision-making is decision-making that favors one person over the other without discernible reason or cause. So, if I have a policy that says we interpret this regulation this way, or being denied because of that policy, and except for this one person that that's arbitrary. Now, if we change the policy, start approving everyone from the change, that's not arbitrary, because we have a justified reason. Change the policy, and that's why. But if we have treat everybody one way and one person the other, that's arbitrary. Capriciously is when you're acting out of fight, you're trying to be punitive, you're trying to, if you will, and so anytime the boards act arbitrarily, capriciously, that's the legal standard that board can overturn decision making. Go ahead. Public inquiries. You will get questions from folks. Hey, as a board member, can you tell me X, Y, Z? So you can answer certain kinds of questions, and there are certain times that you won't necessarily want to answer. If they say, did the board take an action on my brother's case? Well, yes, the board did. You can relay that information. You can also just refer that question and say, you know what, just ask. It'll tell you. That's usually that's a very safe way to go. It's just send those questions to us. And we can provide copies of the minutes, copies of the agenda items. If it's a business item that people want to know about, we can provide, in some cases, copies of final orders. Want to see where they were revoked, we can send you the actual order that revoked your license. Keep going. So don't give your personal opinion in your capacity as as a board member. Not to give your personal opinion, because again, it wasn't you that acted; it was the board as a whole that acted. You won't discuss the facts of the case. That's the kind of thing that will land you before the judge that have those quotes, and when you get into talking with someone about the facts of the case. Relaying what happened is okay. Delving into details of it can be problematic. And the basis for the action, why did the board decide to do that? That's actually all going to be in the public records, minutes, in the final order. If someone asks you that, we as staff can give them the legal grounds for that. Where you can get into trouble is if I kind of remember that. I think it was because X, Y, Z. You might miss the mark and land us in front of a judge. Case exception with the new reason that and create. So generally, don't give the basis for the action. That's something that's in the record. If the board has not taken action yet, this will happen. Folks will contact you and say, "Hey, I've got a case. It's going before the board. I want to talk to you about it." No, no, don't talk to me about it. You do not want to talk about actions, particularly this one of the licensing cases, with anyone prior to the board considering it. Because if someone gives you new information, you might have to recuse yourself. Because you can't consider any information that's outside of the record. And frequently the advice from the office in general is if someone approached you and tried to persuade you to take a side, you'll have to recuse yourself. Typically what happens, our board members will, if they get a call from someone that has a case, they're going to say, "You know what, the board hasn't taken any action on that, I can't speak." So refer those questions to me, and we'll get them answered. Other matters, again, refer these to me if you've got questions. One thing a question that we got that was, can I respond to questions about regulations? And my answer to that would be use your best judgment. If somebody asks, "Hey, how often do I have to renew my license?" You know the answer to that. I'm not going to tell you to refer that to me. You know the answer to that. If it's, how do I interpret this regulation? How does this regulation apply to me? That would be the kind of thing that you probably want to refer to us. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're given advice and it's not quite the right advice, and then they're going to be that person to be mad for you. So you can send that to us. And frequently, we're going to put items on the agenda. If it's an open question that can't be resolved without the board acting, we'll put it on the agenda. You will, from time to time, be contacted by the press. Obviously, be responsive. And when you're talking to them, follow up after you talk to us, or oftentimes board members follow up before. I got this inquiry, am I allowed to respond? And you can talk to the media, share that with us. Just remember, you're not speaking on behalf of the board. Only the board, the full board, do anything on behalf of the board. So they might be interviewing you because you're a board member. Just make it very clear, I'm not speaking for myself. And we're going to, just to save some time, the Code of Virginia goes into kind of the role of DPOR, and we're not going to necessarily delve into this. I do want to touch upon this case that I referenced, the North Carolina Dental Board. case that went to the Supreme Court. Essentially, what the case came down to is the Supreme Court said there needs to be oversight of the board. If the board is under another agency that provides active, meaningful oversight of the board, it can be protected from any antitrust actions against it through the FTC. And that's generally what the Code of Virginia has laid out. There's a reason that case didn't originate. The code actually has already created that structure that the board's operating under. So we do provide that sort of meaningful oversight in the sense that we are going to be relaying with you, and we might even disagree with you and tell you, no, you shouldn't make that decision. Here's why, because the law says this, and if you did that, you'd be acting contrary to the law. So that may happen, and it's nothing personal. We're just trying to make sure that the board is acting in a way that's legally defensible, that won't get you sued, and will obviously respect your actions with respect. We have the authority, the staff has the authority to do investigations. The board makes the final decision. So obviously we are talking about don't discuss cases with board members outside of board meetings. So you can't call someone up and say, hey, did you read that case number 12 on the agenda? That's something else. That crime, wow. Don't do that. You want to discuss those cases at the board meeting in public. And obviously don't discuss it with other parties as well. The cases themselves are confidential information. The decision has to be based on the record too. So you can't say, wow, that crime must have been in the news. I'm going to Google it, read the news articles about it. Don't do that. But if you inadvertently do that, don't let those outside information factor into your decision. Your decision has to be totally based on the facts that are in the record. You have statutory authority to fine, suspend, revoke, or place on probation. The board for Barbers and Cosmetology cannot place people on probation. It's not in their regulations. But the HAZOP board can put people on probation. You can enter into consent agreements. And here's where it gets interesting. So the three things that you can do, you can fine someone up to $2,500 per violation. You can suspend, put someone on probation, or revoke their license. That's what you can do to impose discipline on someone. Consent orders are different because they're agreeing with it. It's like a private contract. You're not imposing it on them, they're agreeing with it. That frees up the board to do a lot of interesting things. Get creative in these consent orders. So you see a lot of extra provisions that are not in here. One of the more interesting ones, we had a school owner who was creating fraudulent training documents in Barbers Cosmo. A very large amount got caught. They had dozens of violations, which they were whacked with $2,500 fines for. They entered into a consent agreement to get some of those fines lower. There's still tens of thousands of dollars fines. They agreed to never, if I remember correctly, it was either they would never practice in the profession again, or they wouldn't practice for 20 years. 20 years or never again in Virginia. That was part of that. You normally, as a disciplinary matter, you can't say you can never come back. But you put in the consent order, they agreed to it. All the fines that you get go to the literary fund. So the D board does not keep the fine money that we impose. A lot of states will do that. And a lot of states can be accused of, well, you're just doing this to support your budget. You're just disciplining money. We're not disciplining anyone. You can go ahead. Where do we get our money from then? If it's not from fines, we get them from our application fees. The agency is supposed to be revenue neutral. We have to reassess our licensing fee every 2 years according to the Callahan Act, which says that every 2 years an agency has to reassess fees, make sure that the revenues and expenditures are within 10% of each other. If it goes outside, if we start making more than 10% of our expenditures, we have to lower our fees. If our expenditures are 15% higher than our revenues, we have to raise our fees. So you'll see a lot of fee actions that happen, regulatory changes, raising, lowering, to stay within that required Accounting Act balance. One other item that we do for exams, obviously all of our professions have a licensing exam. We procure exam services, and so that's a function of the agency. We'll actually enter into contracts. The whole training we'll do in a board meeting, not today, about procuring exam vendors. But there's a very lengthy process that's governed by a whole section of legislative process. We can skip that because we're going to go into it on a different slide. So any questions about that? Okay, so let me take just a moment to kind of reassess our timing here. Okay, let's jump into regulatory review. And this is one I feel confident we can make up some time on this one. We're running a little bit behind. I think it's the first tab up top. It's in the middle there. Regulatory and legislative. Yep. Okay, so when I'm doing onboarding for new licensing specialists, I want to explain how to think about this environment that we operate in. The first thing I do is say, all right, so when you're living in a state, you are here physically present in Virginia. You are subject to Virginia's laws. The laws are the highest level rules that govern anyone. They govern everyone that's physically present. The subset of rules and requirements for people, they're called regulations. And regulations only govern certain people, the people that they apply to. In our case, they are our licensees. People who are not licensed, not required to follow regulations. Now, we can get them for being unlicensed, which is actually a crime in Virginia. So if you are practicing the profession without a license, it's a class 1 misdemeanor for the first 2 offenses, class 6 felony for the third or subsequent offense within a certain amount of time. So it's a crime that you can be criminally prosecuted for, but you're not subject to the regulatory requirements. If you have a license, you are. Then there's an even more narrow category of rules called guidance documents. Guidance documents are essentially the board's interpretation of its regulations and rules. And typically, they're going to apply more to staff. They really ought not create new requirements, but about how do we interpret the requirements that exist. So regulation, the general rule that governs people's rights, promulgated by a state agency and has the force of law. Regulations are law. The way that we do this is through the way that we promulgate them, which is a fancy word for publishing them, making them public, is through the Administrative Process Act. Of course, all the regulations that we create are to protect and promote the health, safety, welfare of the public, least restrictive means. How do we promulgate a regulation? So a regulation is created through a regulatory action. It started with an action by the board. The board is the entity that can start the regulatory process. You have to start it and enact it. There's going to obviously be a lot of stakeholders along the way, and we're going to get into that. But ultimately, it's the board that makes those laws. A regulatory action has a lot of steps in it. That's to ensure that all the various stakeholders that are impacted by the regulation can provide feedback to it. Because there's so many steps to it, it takes a long time to implement a regulatory change. 24 to 36 months. It's a fairly accurate range. I've got some regulatory actions that are, got one that's coming into year 5. I've got one, actually, the hearing aid specialist fee increase, which we've been working on since 2013. We spent 6 years with no activity. The board withdrew it and resubmitted it and had to put in higher fees because they got that much further behind on their budget. And that was 3 years ago. Still slow this way. So that one is combined almost 9 years in the making. So sometimes these can take a really long time. Usually it's in that 24 to 36 month range. So the regulations must meet the governor's policy goals. Again, before it's an executive branch agency who are the governor's appointees. So there's, in addition to the public comment that gets put in there, the governor gets to take a pass at these changes as well. And you can make recommended changes and say, no, you're not going to do that. And there's a couple different points where the governor can get involved in that way. Unless there are special circumstances, regulatory action goes through 3 stages. So let me stage 1 is the following. The board votes to do something. Start a regulatory action. We as staff prepare something called a notice of intended regulatory action, or NORA, and it's a policy document. It's several pages long, and that goes to the Office of the Attorney General, then sends it to the Department of Planning and Budget, then sends it to the Secretary over the agency, which is very shortly the Executive Labor, then sends it to the Governor, then sends it to the public for a public comment period. Those public comments come back to the board. The board will have to view all of them and prepare responses to all of them and incorporate any changes that you agree with the public on happening. That's stage 1. You have to do that exact same thing 2 more times. Stage 3. Incorporating the changes as you go along. The last phase, the final phase, ends with one final public comment period. Obviously, you can't make changes if it ends with a public comment period. And that's the public can actually shut down your change. A certain number of people object to it. Cancel that action. Which you can imagine, if you spend 36 months going through these 3 phases, can be a little hard to see that happen. All of that is designed to make sure the public and other stakeholders process. So we've talked about the NORA, and we don't have to delve into the nitty-gritty of that. There's going to be different lengths public comment periods. There's 30-day, a 45-day, and 21. And you can keep going. So the 3 phases are the NORA, proposed, and final. And keep going. Now, there are a few special regulatory actions that don't have to go through phases. There are emergency regulations. Law changes. The General Assembly says opticians from now on have to wear a certain kind of hat. You would need to update your regulations for that. You don't have to go through the regulatory process to do that. You can just implement emergency regulations that will take effect immediately. There's also fast track regulations. So if there are small, non-controversial changes, we can go through fast track process, which is only 1 stage. It's the same process, but instead of 3 stages, it's 1 stage. And we like that one. We like fast track if we can be confident that it really is not controversial, or it's very small, with tiny bit of controversy. We'll see if we can do it that way. And that usually takes about a year. In theory, it can take as short as 6 months. The shortest I've ever seen it is 9 months. And I've got some that are over that. Yeah.
Who determines if it's qualified to be fast track or?
The Department of Planning and Budget, plus for the emergency, the Office of the Attorney General certifies that. For the fast track, the Department of Planning and Budget certifies that. And so we as staff will do our best to anticipate the kinds of objections and make that determination. Generally, before it even comes to you, we'll advise you when you're considering a change. This is appropriate for fast track. This is appropriate for general. Because it could be controversial, because it's substantial. So we try to get it right. Sometimes we have to go back and forth with DPD to convince them that it really is not controversial. Now, the other thing about fast track is the public can do it with very few objections. I think it's 10. You know, if you want to skip through, it might, I think the slide might say. So it doesn't say. So I think it's 10 objections that the public can do with fast track. And which I've seen happen. That's also kind of heartbreaking. So the fast track is really an option out there for certain changes. Sometimes the board will create what's called an ad hoc advisory committee. The committee that Ms. Green was on several years ago to do the optician apprenticeship change was essentially an ad hoc advisory committee to help the board work on a policy change that incorporates industry stakeholders as well. So from time to time you'll do that. Other times you might just create a subcommittee of the board where they will solicit public comment, but you don't have non-board members participate. There's also a petition for rulemaking. So the public can go on the Virginia Town Hall website, and if enough people sign up, they can try to make the board do a rate change. The petition, you have 10, I think it's 10 folks that signed the petition. Change the regulations so that opticians can wear this particular hat. If they get enough signatures, we'll come to you and you have to consider it. You don't have to approve it, but you do have to at least consider it and vote whether to approve it or reject it. So your regulations are listed in what's called the Virginia Administrative Code. The next couple of slides are really oriented towards our staff. We want to train them specifically how to read regulations. I'm not going to delve very deeply in it, but if we hang on this slide for a second, you will be reviewing regulations and voting to change regulations through your time on the board. Just real quick, how do you read a regulation? You might see it's got a title 18 VAC 41-2020. What do those things mean? Well, it's basically telling you how to find what type of requirement it is. The first thing, the type 18 is the title number. There are 21 titles of regulations. 18 deals with professions and occupations. So that means everything at D4, everything at Department of Health Professions is going to be an 18 title. And then the next number after VAC, which is Virginia Administrative Code, your board number. There are, you see 122 different boards. Barber Cosmo is board 41. HAZOPT is board 80. So that's what you would see that either 18 VAC 41 or 18 VAC 80. The next is the chapter number. Now, chapters are going to be your professions. So if you jump back, sorry. Forward, I guess. I think we're on the next one. Yeah. Chapter 20 means barbers and cosmetologists. Chapter 50 is tattooers. If this was 18 VAC 80, chapter 20 would be the opticians, and chapter 30 is hearing aid specialists. Sometimes I get this switch. But then the last is the section number, and that's going to be the individual requirements. So you might have this particular one, 18 VAC 41-20-20 is the entry requirements. Section 20 is entry requirements for chapter 20, which is barbers and cosmetologists, under the board for barbers and cosmetology. That's just a quick overview so you can read those. We can keep going. The APA provides a number of public notice requirements. So we're going to be, like, for example, for the hearing aid specialist training change that I told you about, my interactions with the department and budget. We're going to be sending out notices to our licensees that have asked for notices about that regulatory change. Sometimes we have a list that we maintain for barbers and cosmetology. We've got hundreds of people on that list. For hearing aid specialists, is kind of interesting. We don't have anyone that signed up for notices. So because the profession is so small, over 600 licensees, we try to reach out to all of them. We'll take our internal email list and just send them a email about the regulatory change, which doesn't happen frequently because we do a lot of regulatory changes as we keep going. I told you a little bit about that economic impact statement, which is going to project the impact of the regulatory changes. And of course, we have time to respond and make our argument. And sometimes we really can convince them to move off the point that they're on. And sometimes we don't. We fail it. But we have already talked about the Callahan Act, so we can skip that. Guidance documents, I think I gave you kind of a brief description of that. Times the boards will consider that. With Barbara Cosmo, in the not too distant future, we're going to do a revision or kind of an audit of all of our guidance documents. Almost some of them we don't really need. So, what about the legislative process? So if the regulations are adopted by you, and they can be started any time. All it takes is a vote of the board to start a regulatory process. Legislation is created by the General Assembly. That can only be enacted or amended or repealed during the General Assembly session, which is about 2 months, January, February. So additions to the Code of Virginia, obviously they have to be passed by the General Assembly. You as the board think there's a problem with the Code of Virginia that you would like addressed. The best mechanism for you to do that is to ask the agency, to ask the governor to make a change. So you could do that in the board meeting, say, hey, we think we need a law. Stick with our opticians wearing those funny hats. We want a law about that. Can you ask the governor to make this law? We as the agency will prepare a document, basically our case to the governor, why this law is needed. It will go to their policy office. We will make a decision. Yeah, we want to pursue this. No, we don't want to pursue this. And typically when the governor has decided, yeah, we do, they'll assist you in finding a delegate to sponsor your legislation, and that will go before the General Assembly. Executive branch does not take a position, we as an executive branch agency, not take positions on legislation unless the governor has taken a position on the legislation. Give you an example of this. About 3 years ago, there was a bill to deregulate barbers and cosmetology. Abolish the board. There's a lot of practitioners that were very upset about this. They would contact us and say, are you okay with this? You want to lose your job? They talk to our license specialists. You're okay with losing your job? I don't have an opinion about this. The governor is not taking a position about it. I don't have an opinion. Until the governor takes a position, we don't have a position. Once the governor takes a position, that's our position on legislation. Which eventually the governor did take a position on that. We were able to oppose it. So legislative process, you as a board member are certainly free to exercise your rights. If there's a bill that you personally oppose and you want to go down to the General Assembly and say, I oppose this bill, you're free to do that. But do not do that in your capacity as a board. You can't speak on behalf of the board. If someone asks you, hey, aren't you a board member? You don't have to lie, tell them the truth. But you're not going to say, well, as a board member, my feeling is this. That's not an appropriate way. If you receive a call from a member of the General Assembly about bill that impacts board, please let me know right away. navigate that situation together. Go ahead, Joe. Oh, that's it. Okay, great. Any questions about legislative process? Okay, well, next we will jump into the disciplinary process, compliance and investigations. Okay, right at the bottom. Okay, so this presentation, we're going to look at the overall process of the investigation. We're going to talk about what your roles are as a board member in that process. And then we're going to talk about licensing cases and the licensing IFFs, which are going to be a little bit different. So Joe, you can skip 2 slides and head to the chart. So this fairly complicated chart is the investigative flow process. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking through this. The key takeaway from this, the green boxes are where you as a board member may interact with the process. So generally speaking, the flow of this process is we are going to receive a complaint. We're going to review that complaint. We're going to investigate the complaint if appropriate. We're going to go to an IFF or have a disciplinary hearing if appropriate. And after that, it will go to the board for a final case decision. That's the broad flow of the process. Let's get into the nitty gritty. So we will receive a complaint. We're going to ask it in writing, so we get a written complaint. And our complaint analysis and resolution section will figure out, is this something that we can, is it a regulation? Is this something that we have authority over? If the answer is no, they close it, and we're done. One of the interesting things about the HAZOP board is we tend to get complaints about unlicensed activity in North Carolina. The last 8 years that I've been with the board, I've seen 3 hearing aid specialist complaints where they closed it because the person was in North Carolina. I don't know why that's happening. We don't have authority over what happens in North Carolina. There are other things that can happen at this point. Let's say there's a claim of negligence. So-and-so did this, use this product on my hair that caused it to fall out. Is that a negligence issue? Could be. They might reach out to you as a board member, you as a practitioner in this field. Can you tell me more about this so I can determine whether this is negligent? Maybe this was appropriate. They might close the case after that. Example, how many times people get bad haircuts? And generally, we're going to right away close the bad haircut case. Had a person make a very compelling argument that it was negligently bad. And there was enough that staff were, well, let's bring the board member process. The board member was able to clearly and articulately determine whether or not. That's all I'm going to say about that 5 series. Based on the outcome of technical review or based on just the initial analysis, they can refer that to the investigation process. And I'll pause there to just say they can also send it for alternatives. We'll talk about that a little bit. It really doesn't come into play with these professions, but that is an option for others. With the investigation, the investigator they can contact the board member for technical review as well. They can close a case, they can refer it back to CAR, they can refer for ADR. But at the end of it, they're going to issue a document called report of findings. That is going to lay out probable cause for a violation. You're going to say, we believe a violation has occurred for the following factual reasons. Here's our exhibit list. Here are all the exhibits. And that's going to go for an informal fact-finding conference or IFF. And we have a whole section, education section, that handles those. And this is, again, the APA comes into play. We've got notice requirements. They get a chance to bring attorneys if they want, present their evidence. there are times, either right before or right after the IFF, the licensee says, you know what, I did it. What can we do to make this go away as quickly as possible? I'm going to pay a fine, etc. We say that's entering into consent. You want to agree to a violation. So we can do a consent order either pre-IFF or post-IFF. But otherwise, you have your IFF. You as a board member may preside over an IFF. We will always have a board member, or almost always have a board member presiding over a disciplinary IFF, where our adjudication staff will ask you to come to the building. They'll give you a script to read to start the IFF. Generally, our staff are going to ask the licensing questions to build out the record. You'll have a chance to ask the licensing questions. And then you're going to make a decision. Did they violate the regulations? Yes or no? What's your justification for that? If so, what do you recommend be the penalty for this violation? You'll make a yes, no, did they do it? And what should be the punishment be? And the adjudication staff are going to help you to write that to a summary and recommendation. And generally, they're going to kind of talk you through it, get all the reasoning. They're going to write it for you and send it to you and sign off on. And then that summary and recommendation, or consent order in that direction, will then come to the board. Board member who presided over the IFF cannot participate in the case decision at the board. So they're going to recuse themselves, leave the room, and then you as the board will decide if you agree with the recommendation and disagree that there was a violation. If the hearing officer said, I find no violation, you can disagree and find the violation. And you can disagree with the sanctions as well and change those. Ultimately, it's the board that gets to decide that. And if you want to go to the next, let's hang out here. Your decision, whether you agree or disagree with the recommendations, they have to be based on facts. In the record, you can't bring outside decisions and you can't go with my gut feeling. Is got to be based on the evidence in the record. If the officer has said, based on the appearance and the demeanor of the licensee, I found them credible, you have to give deference to that. There's actually case law on that that says if a hearing officer finds them credible based on their appearance and demeanor, the board can't overrule that credibility. Now, that doesn't mean you have to still agree with them, but what it does mean is that you can't say, well, board members said they were credible, but I don't think they were credible, so I want to punish them because I think they lied. It's like that kind of thing. You can't overturn the credibility determination. You can certainly say, even if they were credible, I still think we need to punish them. You know, that might be okay. So during the meeting, when you're doing these disciplinary cases, there's going to be two motions there. First is finding of the violation. Yes or no? Did they do it? You're going to vote on that independently. And once you determine if the answer is yes, then you're going to have a separate vote about the sanctions, what types of penalties. For each of those, you'll have an opportunity to debate them and make changes to the recommendations. So the sanctions that you have, you can fine, suspend, revoke. The HAZOP board, I'm pretty certain can do probation as well. And then, of course, in a consent order, you've got much broader latitude on punishment. And the majority is required to impose penalties. So we are pestering you about, hey, are you going to attend our meeting? It's because we need to know we can only get 6 people to a meeting. Let's say for Barbers Cosmetology, you only get 6 people. You know, one of them is going to be recused because they weren't the case. There's no way the board can impose discipline at that point in time, and we will either have to bump the case, cancel the meeting. So when you get the agenda, Kathy's going to send you a letter or an email saying, please RSVP to the meeting. Please do that. That's so important for us to know whether or not we've got a quorum and whether or not we're actually going to be able to impose discipline on any cases we're supposed to do that. And of course, with the other thing is the consent orders. You're voting to agree to the terms. You don't have to accept the terms of the consent order. If you look at a consent order and you say, you know, the recommendation is a fine of $1,500, and you just say, you know what, this is so bad, this person needs to lose their license. You can reject the consent order. At that point, that person's going to go to an IFF or go back to second IFF, depending on when the consent order is. You, from time to time, boards can try to negotiate new terms during the meeting. That can be very difficult to do. We would normally not advise that. We would just say, just kick it back to staff to work out new terms. But in theory, you could do that. The licensee would have to be present and agree to it there on site. We could print out new documents. It's extremely complex. So that's not really the ideal way to do it. The ideal way is just kick it back to staff and we'll do it. Go ahead. Okay, so that's the disciplinary process. What about licensing? When do folks have to go through a licensing? Typically, in 3 situations. The most common is if you have a criminal history. Staff are going to review applications if the person indicated they have a criminal history. We have for Barbers and for Opticians a guidance document called the Criminal History Matrix. Essentially, it's rules that the board approved say if a conviction is of this nature, staff can approve it. We don't need to review it. If it's of this other nature, it has to come to the board for the board to determine. Generally speaking, Code of Virginia 54.1-204 says there cannot be barrier crimes. There's no crime that a person can commit that automatically keeps them from getting a license. The board has to make a case-by-case decision on whether the crime relates to the profession, whether that person should be denied. The way that you make that case decision, in this section of the code, there are 9 factors. The code says you have to consider all 9 factors. Those are going to be things like the nature and seriousness of the offense, the age at which the person committed the offense, the nature of the offense and how it relates to the profession, evidence of rehabilitation, job history, etc. So there's 9 of these factors. We do not, for the licensing IFFs, we do not have board members preside over them. We have an agency presiding officer that is trained to go through those 9 different factors. We always tell folks, if you have a licensing IFF, the 9 factors, that's not 9 questions. You're going to get a lot of questions, but they're going to be developed a factual record around these factors so that the board can make an informed decision about it. So what you'll end up getting as a board member on the back end, after the IFF, get the application, get the list, the referral memo that our staff would have prepared and said, here are the crimes that caused this IFF. Necessitated it. You'll get the hearing officer's summary recommendation, which will analyze all 9 factors, and then have a recommendation. Yes, based on these factors, you should approve it, or based on these factors, you should deny the license. And you'll get a transcript from the hearing, so you can read the licensee's words, and you want to read the licensee's words about the matter. And then you, of course, get to make the decision. There's only one vote on this. It's either you're going to have a motion to approve the license, or oftentimes the motion is to approve the recommendation. If you vote to approve the recommendation, that means whatever the recommendation was, that's what you want. Folks can sometimes get confused because somebody might say, I moved to approve the recommendation, seconded, but the recommendation was for denial. So that's a motion to deny the license. So there can be some confusion around that. If it looks like folks are confused, we'll try to step in and clarify. This is a motion to deny the license. And again, you can agree or disagree with the recommendation. It's up to you. If you are going to disagree with the recommendation and deny a license, so if the recommendation is approved, prove you want to deny, you have to state in the record grounds for denial based on the 9 factors. So you have to say, based on the lack of evidence of rehabilitation, the fact that this profession will give them more opportunity to engage in this crime. There you listed your 9-factor reasons. It doesn't have to get all 9 factors, but a couple of reasons throughout the life. If you are taking a recommended denial and going to approve, you don't have to. No one's going to. When they got their license, and didn't think they were going to get it, they're not going to sue you for that. Because you have to schedule all these hearings and you have to get transcripts, and all of that has to be completed within several weeks after the board meeting. The process can take 2 to 4 months to get that licensing process. The criminal history matrices that we created were designed to reduce the number of people that would have to go through this process. So if you have to wait 4 to 6 months to get your license, that's a huge economic burden. And the matrix is designed to, if the board doesn't want to deny licenses for these crimes, let's not make them go through this process. So every few years, we revise the matrix. We think we can screen more people out of the IFF process. One of the biggest changes we made was the Barber Cosmo. We went back through years and years of data. Every single IFF we've ever done, listed out every single crime with every single applicant for the IFFs. We had hundreds and hundreds of applicants with thousands of different convictions, and we analyzed the data. What we found is that the board had never denied a license for someone that only had misdemeanor convictions. So if you had no felonies, Barber Cosmo board never denied a license. So we revised our matrix and eliminated 30% of the IFFs. That translated to about 50 less people that had to wait for the system. So it's really an important tool that you can use to save the licensing money, time, the stress, and anxiety of having to talk about all of these convictions and have your fear and your future and hopes on the line in the hands of strangers. So there are certainly times when the board needs to review the convictions, but you get a chance to say no, you don't want to. So, questions about the IFF disciplinary licensing process? Just to clarify, licensing IFFs are almost always criminal convictions. However, the other 2 main categories that you'll see, the Barber Cosmo, the next one would be you have time to try to pull a quick one on the board and lie on their application about something. You have to send it to the board for that. The third one, you see sometimes the Barber Cosmo, probably about equally in Kazakh, is someone thinks that they ought to get a license based on the qualifications that they have that don't meet the board's requirements. So we'll say the regulation says you have to complete a 600-hour aesthetics program, and this person says, well, I completed a 200-hour program 30 years ago, and I've been practicing for 30 years. You can get my license based on that. We're going to send it to the board. So your regulation says you have to have 600 hours of training. This person has 300. What we will tell you as part of that process is that you as the board need to enforce your own regulations. If you start waiving your regulations, everyone has to follow it, not this person. So we're going to say to protect yourself, force you. Any other questions? Yeah.
At the beginning of this complaint process, you had the complaints received, and then it's reviewed, and then place came in, but this is the rationale as to why we closed it, you never saw it?
That's a good question. For Barber Cosmo, we have never done. For hearing aid specialists and opticians, we had a request many years ago that the board be notified when cases occur. And so we will provide that, or we should say we used to provide that regularly as just an update. There was never a specific request to explain the rationale for closing it. As part of that, when I first started with the board, I made an effort to include that because it doesn't really matter if we just say 3 cases closed, does that really help you if you don't know the rationale? So we've been trying to do that, and we had to stop doing that about 2 years ago. The technology changed, and made a lot harder for our side of the licensing side of things to get that data from the disciplinary side of things. So the last year, we haven't provided those reports. That's something that if the board wants us to continue doing or do more detail, we can do that. There is a limit to what we can say. So we can speak generally about those cases, but the more specific we get, the more we get to protected information.
My second question, when we're talking about the IFS for licensure, on the application, the candidate's supposed to list any felonies. When the application, this is just a process question. When the application comes in, do the individuals reviewing those, are background checks actually done to see, or are they just going off of what the person reported?
Right now, we are just going off of the person. So we do not do an independent background check on our licenses. I would say that we've done an intermittent audit and very rarely ever find the places where we actually end up catching the people that are not true. Because generally what happens is they forget that they weren't on. So when they're renewing or reinstating their license, they disclose it. And we look at it and say, wait a second, what's going on here? So you will frequently, especially Barbers, look at disciplinary cases or licensing cases where they had obtained the license by fraud because they didn't disclose when they initially applied. It's not a very high volume number. We have, let's say, 72,000 licenses that are in the state of Florida. Cosmo might get 2 of those. So, and for HAZOP, I'm not aware that we've ever been to. Any other questions? So we have our experienced board member panel, and then we'll have another sort of longer Q&A at the end. That's going to start in 25 minutes. We've got one more presentation that we can definitely get through. I think it's going to take like 10 minutes. So if you all want me to take another break, we can do that. Or if you want to, let's say, plow through the next presentation and then take a break until 12. That sound good? Okay. All right, so this last presentation, I realize it says Board for Barbers and Cosmetology, we've got data for both boards. We're just going to talk about the licensing process, how do folks get their license. They have to meet the eligibility requirement first. What is the eligibility requirement? So you've got to have a certain amount of training. There's different kinds of training on the profession. In most of our professions, you can either go to school or you can do an apprenticeship. And I've got for hearing aid specialists, we've got that under apprenticeship. It's technically, not an apprenticeship, but it's on-the-job training. So you can see barbers, cosmetology, estheticians, nail techs, tattooers, master permanent cosmetic tattooing, opticians, and hearing aid specialists can either go to school or do an apprenticeship. A couple of our professions can only go to school. There is no apprenticeship. That's wax techs and permanent cosmetic techs. And then for body piercing, it's only apprenticeship. There are no body piercing schools. There is a school in the United States called the world's only body piercing school, and our experience with them is training program. Documents do not match the actual training. You can go ahead to the next slide. Oh, and even if they did, the regulations don't have a school. The regulations only say apprenticeship. So those methods are actually laid out in the apprenticeship. Now, so what types of license can you get? For Barber Cosmo, there are 5 different types of licenses that you can get. You can get the practitioner. You can get a temporary permit. You can get a shop or salon license. So any facility or place, vehicle, event where these services are regularly performed for compensation has to have a facility license, shop, salon, parlor, or spa license. You can get an instructor license, and you can get a school license. In these 5 license types, we have barbers, cosmetologists, nail technicians, wax technicians, master barbers, estheticians, master estheticians, body piercers here only, tattooers, permanent cosmetic tattooers, and master permanent cosmetic tattooers. All 5. So we've got 35 licenses that we can issue just in the board of barbers and cosmetology. As opt, so much easier. No offense. It's just the individual licenses. Hearing aid specialist, the optician, and then the hearing aid specialist temporary permit, which is that training license. No establishment licenses in HAZOP. Okay. So once you've completed your training, and of course the amount of training you need is specified in the regulation, then you have to get licensed. So for barbers and cosmetology, we have an exam vendor called PSI. They administer actually almost all the exams for the agency. So how do you qualify for the exam? Well, you have to go to their website. You're going to fill out an online application, submit your additional documents, so a photo, any criminal history, your training verification shows that you have completed your training. And we train our vendor to do exam eligibility. They get very detailed criteria from us. They make the decision, has this person met the eligibility, so they can schedule and take their exam. For hearing aid specialists, we have, for the written exam, we administer the practical, or sorry, for the written exam, it's the International Hearing Society's International Licensing Exam, or ILE, that is the theory exam, the written exam. That's administered 4 times a year. The practical exam is administered here by T4 on site. So we have an exam section that actually will administer the hearing aid specialist practical exam. The rules and regulations, and there's a little jumbled in there, due to some authority that was given to the agency directly during the pandemic, we were able to change from D4 administering the rules and regulations on site as part of the practical exam to having the rules and regs administered by our exam vendor anytime it's needed. So rather than having to wait for one of those 4 days per year to take the rules and regulations, the hearing aid specialists just go and take it whenever. So for the opticians, the written and practical exam are administered by the American Board of Opticians. Right?
Question.
Yeah.
On your slide there, you're saying 4 times per year. You mean a window for application because they can take up any time in the year now? on ABLH Daily website. So are you, is EPOR, are we specifying the candidates can only take it at a certain time?
Yes. Yeah, and that's actually in the contract. And that's an item that was negotiated. So there's a balance, and we'll talk about this in a second. The way that the contracts are negotiated is via public procurement. And I can't necessarily disclose some of the things that happen as part of the procurement process. But what I can say is that we negotiated 2 4 times.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm on.
It was,
our
we,
website, so
there was not an option to do
the question I get from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it used to be, there were 2 exam administrations. We changed it to 4 2 years ago now. And there were only 4. This is actually the first I've heard that they were willing to test those 4.
Yeah, since COVID.
Okay.
If you go on their website now, it's, instead of it being, like in smaller, like 2 or 3 week windows each quarter, it's, well, if you apply up, by March, well, then you can test anytime in this 3-month window, and if you apply by July, it's the next 3 months. So basically, you can test anytime during the year.
Yeah, and so our system is kind of similar to that. There's essentially, there are 4 application windows. And then once you're approved, you have, I think it is a 60-day period that you can test anytime in that 60-day period, but you can only test once in that 60-day period. That was the issue that we focused on because, we want people to be able to test as frequently as possible. But it's once in that 60 days. And certainly if the board wanted to say, well, we want them to be able to test either one in that 60-day period, that could be something that in the next exam of the contract we could look at incorporating something like that. Obviously, it depends on whether a vendor can do that. So whether
I don't want to take it on too far off topic. I was told that recently you guys already prepaid for licensure exam. And she received letters that she denied the ability to take it in those recent coming. She missed the window. Or is that because she's told that she'd have to wait several months before she can take that? Of course, coming out of school, you lose a lot of.
Yeah, not knowing the specifics, I can tell you the general situations where that would come up. Probably the most common would be the application. So on our website, we say your application has to be submitted by this date. We build in a couple weeks for our staff to review it, get missing documents. So folks will submit their application, but not submit the training document or the proof of high school completion. The regulation says you have to submit that. So we'll reach out to them immediately and say, we need this by this date, or we won't make this exam. If they don't give it to us by that date, we miss our window to get them approved schedule. So that's the most common situation. Something that happens with the ABO from time to time is folks will apply directly to the ABO. They actually have to apply with us. They're taking the ABO in Virginia, they're taking the state licensing exam. You have to get approved to do that. So the ABO should be catching folks that applying directly with them without having to go on before first. They might say, you can't take it, you have to go apply with before first.
Right, and then if they're going to graduate or going to finish their coursework like at the beginning of May, they can't apply until they've completed, have their transcript, because the transcript has to come with the application. They can't apply at a time like.
That's gotta be it.
Yeah, well, the last 8 years at least.
Yeah, so the regulation, the regulation hasn't changed. There may have been a time where the regulation is not enforced strictly, but the regulation is pretty clear. you can't be approved until you. That's been the case going back well into the 90s. So yeah, keep going. All right, so after the exams are completed, the scores get come to D4 and the license is issued. Unless, the next slide, there are some delays in the process. So what are the kinds of delays that we see? Errors on the application that we've got to figure out and resolve. They can leave documents out, or it can be a non-routine application. What is a non-routine application? That's going to be an application where criminal history, prior disciplinary action, we think there's discrepancies with their training or they're trying to apply fraudulently. We're going to flag those, call them non-routine applications. And of course, we can apply the matrix to see if criminal history passes, we can prove it. But frequently, those non-routine applications are going to come to you through a licensing item. And we've talked about 54.1-204. That's the we can't abridge anyone's rights without doing that 9-factor analysis. Just to let you know some basic stats about the IFF. For Barbers Cosmo, we do about 100 licensing IFFs per year. For HAZOP, we do maybe 0.75. Not a lot of Barbers Cosmo or HAZOP licensing. About 90% of the licensing IFF criminal convictions are approved. It's a pretty high approval rate. There are, again, no barrier to crime. So we have people that are currently incarcerated, they've gone through the IFF process, got licenses. We have folks that have been convicted of every crime imaginable, that have gone through that process and been licenses. And there are folks that might have what we might consider not that bad of a crime, like some distribution stuff, have not been licensed because of those 9 factors. No evidence of rehabilitation. Nexus. So one common example is someone who has been dealing drugs out of a barbershop and been licensed revoked. Time Pokey, as our old adjudication director used to say, that crime has an obvious nexus to the profession that the board has denied a license for. So of course, again, it's an application it's an action by the full board to deny an application. And we've already talked about, we do operate in the full view of the public. We want folks that have these IFS, these non-routine applications, to be engaged in the process and have meaningful participation to be heard by the board. Applicants as well. One of our big goals is to be very transparent and to educate licensees as they go through, whether it's the non-routine process or it's the regular process. We spend a lot of time training our licensing specialists on your regulations so that they can be informed, answer questions, and help folks navigate this process as best as they can. So, any questions? Okay, so what we'll do is let's take a 5-minute break, and a little bit before 12:15, we'll reconvene and then we'll go to our experience. So we're going to take just a quick break, and we will go ahead and mute the microphone here since the meeting is on a break, and we'll unmute it in just a few minutes, about 5 minutes.
Matthew, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
great. How have you been?
Great. About yourself?
Oh, I've had some rocky months, but
Uh-oh.
yeah. I'll tell you about it next time we meet.
Okay.
And that's why I wasn't able to be at the last board meeting.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's working out better as we're going forward.
Well, we shall see. I'll just leave it at that. We shall
Okay.
see. Yeah.
Well, I wish you the best.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, or afternoon, I should say.
How you doing, Steve?
I'm good. I'm good. Ms. LaPierre, I've got a question for you. I know that you're kind of limited in your availability. How long or what time do you think you'll have to hop off the meeting?
Well, I'm going to try and stay on until 1 o'clock.
Okay. All right. Great. Perfect. All right. Thank you. So what we'll do then, when we start the experienced board member panel is I'll go ahead and do kind of kick it off and let you introduce yourselves. And then, with the questions that we've got, I think I'll ask the question and then give you each board member a chance to respond to it. And we'll just kind of take turns like that.
Okay.
Great. So did y'all have any questions about the panel or process or anything before we get started?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay.
How's your turnout?
That's good. We have almost all of our new board members who've been appointed in the last year are here. I think we are just missing one of them.
Excellent.
Great.
Any of our new board members present?
Yeah. So Bo Machayo is present for the Barber Cosmo board.
Good. I'm glad he was present at the last meeting too.
Sorry to leave you guys in the lurch.
Oh, hey, Margaret,
that's
things
all right.
happen. Come on.
Yeah, you had very important things to do.
Huh?
Yeah, he was saying I had important things to do.
Oh,
Yeah,
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there was one vote in particular that was, it needed one more vote in order for it to be finalized. And he was with us as far as on the call, but Steve kept asking him,
yeah,
and so I think, if I'm not mistaken, Steve got to a point where he was going to have to postpone or push it off.
yeah,
And then at the last second, he finally came on and voted.
yeah,
It was crazy.
yeah. Well, Steve, do you think the next board meeting will be in person?
Yes, the plan is to have the next Barber Cosmo meeting in person.
Okay, good.
Yep.
I think by
And
that time, everybody should at least have one or both of their shots by then.
Yeah, and we'll still have social distancing and the mask requirement, and kind of as we're doing today, we don't have food or shared beverages containers. We've got individual drinks on the desks and snacks, but that's about it.
Okay.
Oh, so they're really getting gypped, aren't they?
Yeah, unfortunately.
There's always next time, right? Wasn't Mary talking about trying to do this yearly or at least every couple of years?
Yeah, so we had a new board member training, actually the all board member training about 2 years ago. It was a 2-day conference where we had a hotel, conference center rented out, and we had about 150 board members from all the boards assembled to do this kind of training, 2 days of this kind of training. And hopefully the food was pretty good. We had meals provided. And one of the really nice things was we had a variety of speakers. Today they got stuck with me all day. So they really suffered.
Well, they don't know that you're a star, Steve?
Surprisingly, no one fell asleep. I don't know how that happened. All right, well, it is 12:15. So I see we still have a couple of board members. We might wait just a minute for the couple of board members to reassemble, but so just as a way of introductions, we will move into the experienced board member panel. And so what we have, which will probably be everyone's favorite part of the day, where I stop talking and people that know what they're doing do start talking. So we've got a series of questions that we're going to ask board members who have been on the board for a while, and they can kind of give you a varied response. I think that, and if you'll excuse me a second, I'm going to sit down. I do have the questions here. So bear with me just one moment. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do is just start out, if we could have the board members who are participating, just introduce yourself by telling us a little bit, obviously your name, and tell us about which board you're on and position you hold, and a little bit about your board experience. And we have 3 board members from our board for Barbers and Cosmetology, and I think we're awaiting one of our experienced members from the HAZOP board who should be joining us shortly. But if we can start with Lonnie Quisenberry, I believe is on the call. If you want to start us out. Yeah, Mr. Quisenberry, can you hear us okay? And Mr. Quisenberry, if you can hear us but are having trouble with getting your audio to work, I believe you can hit *6 to unmute yourself. So you may need to do that. It's *6. Oh, okay, so you just muted yourself. So try that again. *6 again to unmute yourself. All right, go ahead. Oh, and it looks like we are still having difficulty hearing you. And Mr. Quisenberry, are you, well, it's calling from your cell phone. I'm not sure there's going to be an easy way to fix this. Would you be able to disconnect and redial in and see if maybe that will fix the audio? And we can go ahead and while we're waiting for Mr. Quisenberry to rejoin, Ms. LaPierre, would you mind jumping in then? Tell us a little bit about your experience and the position you held on the board.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret LaPierre. I am chair on the board for Barbers and Cosmetology. I started long before my time on the board. I started as being part of the committee who brought the aesthetics regulations before the General Assembly in 2005. And then I was appointed to the board in 2013. And I'm now coming up on the end of my second term. I've held the position of vice chair and I am now chair. And my seat on the board is for aesthetics instructors for schools. And I've also participated in several subcommittees.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Quisenberry, can we test your audio again? Do you want to try talking to us? So we are not able to hear you. I do apologize for this.
It may be a volume thing on his phone, possibly.
Yeah, and Mr. Quisenberry, if you want to just try to kind of experiment with some things on your phone, my tool chest is depleted. I've got the *6 thing, and that's about as much as I know for folks that are calling in. But if you want to keep experimenting, and if you can get it to work, we'll defer to you at that point. And in the meantime, Mr. Roberts, would you mind telling us a little about your board experience and the position that you hold?
Sure. My name is Matt Roberts, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys. I was appointed to the board in 2017 or the end of 2017, and I am in my second term, and I represent the nail technician member on the board, and I'm currently the vice chair on the board, and have served on several of the standing subcommittees. And the last subcommittee outside of that, I believe, was on the state testing subcommittee for the testing company that goes out for bid each 3 years, I think it is. And I basically represent the individual licensed nail technician, but I have also had a private school, and I also a teacher in public school. So even though I just represent the nail technician on the board, I'm very well rounded when it comes to different matters that do come before the board.
All right, thank you. Mr. LaPierre, thinking back on your first few meetings, what surprised you the most about serving on the board?
Well, when I started, it was how long the meetings were, because we listened to every case. Every case was called, so I wasn't prepared for it to be a half a day. But other than that, was how long it took for regulations to be amended and approved. Even though I had been on the other end of getting the regulations before the General Assembly, once they were in place, it was really surprising how long it took to get any changes made.
Thank you. And Mr. Roberts, what surprised you the most about serving on the board?
I agree 100% with what Margaret just said, or Ms. LaPierre. It really is amazing at how long it does take to get things done. But I think what surprised me was the ability of the board to actually participate in getting things done. And I definitely agree on the amount of business before the board. It has gotten better, but that's of course because we've added a couple meetings to each year. But there are definitely a lot of cases before the board and a lot of business before the board. And in the time that we're in now, of course, that has shortened that a little bit. But it's an important vehicle for people that want to get licensed, and also people that have licenses, for them to be able to have their cases heard and for them to go about their practicing of their trade.
Thank you. And Mr. Quisenberry, I do apologize that we're not able to work this kink out. And certainly please feel free to continue to stay on the call, and if we can get this audio working, we'll wrap you into things. So, Ms. LaPierre, how many meetings did you have to attend before you felt comfortable with the process and to start actively participating?
Well, I attended quite a few meetings before the aesthetics regulations were approved, because I just wanted to see what was involved on the regulatory side. And once the aesthetics regulations were approved, I attended more frequently because we're one of the last states to get aesthetics regulations. And with our industry changing so much, I wanted to familiarize myself with the process before I made my decision to sit on the board. And once the regulations for aesthetics were approved, me being a licensee and an instructor, I saw that there were some loopholes, as I would say, that needed to be corrected or filled. And so I wanted to get a better idea of what the process was. So when I decided to apply for the board, I could be better prepared to help our licensees get those needs met.
And Mr. Roberts, how many meetings did it take you before you felt comfortable with the process and you were ready to start participating?
And Steve, I'm sorry you were muted, but I believe you were asking me the same question as Ms. LaPierre.
Correct. Yep.
My situation, I guess, is a little different in that I've served on many different boards. This is the first one at the state level, but I was very familiar with the process. I was very familiar with really the way most boards do operate when it comes to voting and things like that. And so because I had that form or that frame of reference, I did feel pretty comfortable after my first one or two meetings. I will say, going beyond that, the more meetings you attend, the more comfortable you do feel about, when it comes to making motions, when it comes to seconding motions, when it comes to the protocol and the way that business is done, you do become more comfortable, so that you so that you do know what the process and everything is going on.
Right, thank you. And Mr. Quisenberry, welcome to the meeting. And it looks like your computer is muted, but you should be able to just click the icon to unmute it.
I apologize for that. I could not get the computer to come up, but let me turn my phone on. Okay. Can you hear me okay, Steve?
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for persevering. So, Mr. Quisenberry, can you tell us a little bit about your board experience and what positions you've held on the board?
Okay. Well, this is my fourth appointment to the board. So this is the fourth governor that's made the appointment for me. And out of those 4 terms, I probably 3/4 of the time I have served as chair. And it's been a great experience. I just feel like all of us need to give something back to our profession. This is certainly the way that we do it, is by helping to improve our profession. And there's several things that I've really been proud that throughout the board that I've been on that has been accomplished in the state.
Thank you. So, Mr. Quisenberry, now this may be going back a ways because of your 4 terms or 4 different appointments to the board. It's more than 4 terms. So, thinking back in your early days on the board, what were the things that most surprised you about serving on the board?
Well, I think the main thing is that, everyone thinks because of this appointment and you're on that board that you have all this power to just change all of the things that, I would have hairdressers tell me, oh, well, you all need to change this or change that. And so finding out the bureaucracy as far as I think maybe Mr. Roberts and Ms. LaPierre both have mentioned how long it takes to get things through. So that probably was the biggest surprise for me.
So the next question, Ms. LaPierre, can you discuss the importance of being prepared for meetings?
Well, for me, it's really important to be fully prepared. And because if we're not taking the time to look at every case, when it comes time to vote, how are you going to be able to to deny or approve someone's licensure? If we're not prepared, it's a real disservice to the person who we're trying to help establish their life or get their credentials for the first time. So it's really important for us to be prepared when we come to the meetings. I mean, if you're not and you're trying to scan through a case as it's called to the floor, then you've not really prepared yourself for what background information is involved in that for that person or that licensee. And it reflects poorly on us, because if we're just not being prepared and we're just coming in giving an approval or a denial without preparing, it just reflects poorly on us. Because there are some times that we do have to, or we feel that we should deny a person their licensure, and we need to be able to if need be, stand up and say why we feel that way. So not preparing yourself is, it's important.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, do you have anything that you would add to that?
I would agree 100%. And the other thing that not being prepared does is it really does take your focus off of all of what's going on, because you're trying to figure out, okay, well, I'm voting on this, voting on that. I'm not speaking on my behalf or Ms. LaPierre's, because we're always prepared. Mr. Quisenberry too, as well. but it's noticeable when there are members that are not prepared, and it's not fair to that license holder or that potential licensee. And so to me, it's imperative that you are prepared and that you have reviewed the information to fairly vote in those particular situations, but also the business before the court. You need to either have done research, or you need to have really thought through what your thoughts are about discussing that item with the board, in order for the board to have a well-rounded conversation about the particular item.
Mr. Quisenberry, do you have those comments?
I'm sorry, you're coming in muffled with your mask, Mr. Kirshner.
Yeah, let me repeat the question.
You're on mute again, Steve.
Yep. Oh, and so can you all hear me at this point online?
Yes.
I have my computer muted because it'll cause feedback with the other computer that's running the presentation.
Okay.
But you should be able to hear me through the other laptop.
Yep.
Mr. Quisenberry, do you have anything that you would add to the importance of being prepared for meetings?
Well, I agree with everything that both board members said here, but also it's an embarrassment.
It is.
The person who is not prepared should be embarrassed, but also as a board member, I'm embarrassed when it shows that another board member hasn't done their homework and they're sitting there. And also when, if you're even listening to a person present their case and you see board members either scrolling through their phone or scrolling on the computer, and when these people's licensures are at stake, I think we as board members need to give them our undivided attention throughout the day for the meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to reverse the order, and with the next question, we'll start with Mr. Quisenberry again. What were the strategies, or what were your strategies for reviewing the agenda, and how long does it take you to prepare for a typical board meeting?
Well, when I first became a board member, it was nothing for me to spend 4 to 6 hours preparing for a meeting. But as throughout time and understanding different cases and all, I now, and of course their agendas have been much shorter since we're meeting every other month, but I still spend a good couple of hours reviewing. And, you know, and I make notes throughout. I make notes that if I have a question about something, whether I need to go back and reference something in an IFF, or just whether or not I agree with the recommendation that's being made. So, you know, it varies with the heaviness of your load, but it's still, it can be time consuming if you do it properly.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Roberts, what are your strategies for reviewing the agenda?
What I normally try to do is, you normally get the agenda a couple weeks before the board meeting, and excuse me, keep in mind, you know, all of us are busy. So it's a matter of being disciplined with yourself and trying to make sure you review the agenda almost as soon as you get it, just so you know how many cases are before the board or how long it is going to take you to review for it. And then I try to review at least a week before. I try to re-review the night before. And, you know, I feel that it's important to re-review the night before because that time has passed and you are getting ready to have your meeting. And when it comes to the notes that I make, I always make notes on how I'm going to vote because I've looked over the information. And so I always put yes or no. I always put down, you know, what the sanction is and everything that's involved with it. But there are times where I'll put a question mark next to it. And that question mark normally will remain even when I review the night before. It will remain until the morning of. And so when we are having those conversations or we are listening to the person, if they're before us, I'll make my decision at that point. But I have reviewed the information and I feel like I am making a decision based on their input or based on other things that may be happening that morning as far as that case goes.
Thank you. And Ms. LaPierre, what are your strategies for reviewing the agenda?
Well, I view the agenda pretty much the same way as Mr. Quisenberry and Mr. Roberts. And depending on the number of cases that we have before us, I break it down so I can review a certain number of cases every day so that I'm not pushed to the last week or the night before. So, and like Mr. Roberts and Mr. Quisenberry, I make notes for every case. If I have a question of how I'm going to vote, like Mr. Roberts, I put a question mark. And so I'm looking at the agenda every day for those 2 weeks. And that way I can be fully prepared. And like Mr. Roberts, I'll then go back and review my notes the night before to make sure that I've got everything prepared. So that's my strategy.
Thank you. And Mr. Quisenberry, if you had to give a single piece of advice to a new board member about how to prepare for a board meeting, what would it be?
Just be prepared in itself, as far as be knowledgeable in what you're going to be going over, you know, with the meetings. Be aware of the different types of what we vote on, from consent orders, prima facie cases, licensure, and disciplinary. Be prepared on what each of those cases involve. And like with, if you're voting on a disciplinary, know that you have to vote on a violation first before you can vote on sanctions. And just be aware of the, you know, the entire agenda and how it will be handled.
And Mr. Roberts, what would your single piece of advice be to a new board member?
I definitely agree with Mr. Quisenberry. I guess the other thing I would say would be the recommendations that are made by the agency are very important. But they're not the only thing involved when it comes to that case. So my recommendation on that would be to look at what the suggestion is when it comes to that recommendation, and look at the entirety of that particular case file, and remember that you are responsible for that license holder, if they are a current license holder, or that particular person that's trying to get their license. My apologies, I'm in one of those lights that automatically goes off if there's no movement. But you know, some of the cases have quite a bit of paperwork involved with them, and there is a lot to consider. And so it really is your responsibility to be well informed. And so my advice would be to make sure you're reviewing that case, the entire case.
And Ms. Lockyer, what would your single piece of advice be for a new board member on preparing for the meeting?
Well, I agree with Mr. Quisenberry and Mr. Roberts, but the other thing that I would add is, now that you are a board member, you need to know the regulations for each of the professions that come under us. If you don't know the regulations, then how can you really understand what's involved to the case that's before us? So you've got to take time to read every regulation and familiarize yourself with each profession and what regulations are involved under each profession, because that is really going to be the crux of helping us determine whether or not that licensee gets their license or not, or whether it be play a role in whatever disciplinary action is involved. So you have got to know the regulations.
All right, thank you. All right, I will reshuffle the order again, and I think Mr. Roberts hasn't had a chance to start out yet. So, Mr. Roberts, how would you describe an IFF to a new board member? Oh, and Mr. Roberts, you are muted. I think you're muted. Yep.
Sorry. How would I describe it? I would describe it as the particular individual or organization that is been cited with a violation. It's their opportunity to it's kind of like a deposition where they are going to plead their case. They're going to answer questions from the agency member as well as the board member that's present. And it's an opportunity for that person to say, I either did this, and this is why I did it, and plead for leniency, or it could be a situation where they admit that they did it wrong, that they did this wrong, and these are the extenuating circumstances, whatever it may be. But it's where all of the information that the agency has collected in reference to that violation, and the person that is charged with that violation gets an opportunity to have a sit-down discussion with the board member because of their knowledge of the regulations, and because it's the way that it's supposed to be as far as the board member being present. It's a way for the board member to feel comfortable making a recommendation to the board about how serious the violation is, what the sanctions as in the fine should be. And it's an opportunity for that license holder or that organization to plead their case.
Thank you. Ms. LaPierre, how would you describe an IFF?
Thinking back to my first IFF, for me, it was like having a little mini court case. I mean, you're there with the adjudicator who knows all the legal ramifications from DPOR, and they're there to assist you in helping you with understanding the sanctions. But you're there with the licensee, and sometimes they may be there with their attorney or interpreter. You're also there with a court reporter, so everything is documented and written down. It can be a little bit intimidating the first time, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you are with knowing what takes place in the IFF. And if you have questions that even you as a board member don't understand, the adjudicator is there to help you clarify what questions you may have, so that you can make the best decision or best recommendations for that case.
Thank you. And Mr. Quisenberry, how would you describe an IFF to a new board member?
Well, I think Mr. Roberts and LaPierre both did a great job in explaining what it is. So I would just sort of like to reiterate to the board members that although this is a recommendation, you don't have to accept that recommendation if you don't agree with it. And also remembering that all of the discipline cases do have to be handled by a board member as far as chairing that, but the staff handles the licensure IFS. So although a recommendation is made, study that. You may agree, you may not agree, but that's just saves a lot of time for board members and meetings that this information is already presented. We have it ahead of time, so as the meetings don't go on and on. So.
All right, thank you. Mr. Roberts, have you ever been involved in a technical review for a case? And if so, how did your expertise help the investigation?
Yes, I've been involved in several, and in my capacity on the board, as far as the licensure that I represent, my experience and my expertise in that has been extremely helpful to the investigators in those particular situations. And I feel that if I had not been the one present or involved in that, I don't think the investigation or technical review would have been as thorough, and I don't feel that certain things would have been brought to light that were brought to light by me because of my experience and expertise in that area.
All right, thank you. Ms. LaPierre, I'm pretty confident you've served as a subject or technical review. How does your expertise help you or help the investigation?
Just like with Mr. Roberts, I think my expertise in the aesthetics field helped a great deal when I was brought in on a case where it was an aesthetics licensee, because I'm not only being a licensee myself and practicing in the field, was also a business owner, and also an instructor. So I was able to kind of have a well-rounded view of what the charges might be from that that might have been brought against the licensee. But there was also a time that I was called in on a tattoo case. I'm not a tattooer. However, by preparing myself and understanding the regulations for tattooing, again, as a business owner and as an instructor, I felt that my help in that case was invaluable to the investigator, and we were able to make a determination in that case. So yes, I do feel that, my expertise paid off.
And if I could add one thing too, and thank you, Ms. LaPierre, for saying what you were saying, because there are also times where there might be a case that has been brought to the agency, and because of the technical information and the expertise that we have, we find that there is no case, that there is no violation, and so that's important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Mr. Quisenberry, how has your expertise helped during technical reviews?
Well, I hope that it has. Let me say that first. But we just have to remember that the examiners and all know the regulations and follow up on compliance, but they don't know the in and outs of the professions. So therefore, I think that's where we come in. And of course, me being the cosmetology board member. But I've done this a lot. I remember one in particular that the investigator kept saying that a client had lost hair that had been like burned from a perm. And he kept saying perm. And I said, well, I can't follow you on that. Send me the paperwork. And of course, it was a chemical relaxer, and I'm thinking a perm to curl the hair and little things like that he had no idea the difference in the terminology. And also, I think the last one I consulted on, and this follows up with Mr. Roberts' response there, was a gal would not let it go with her complaint because her hair was cut shorter than she wanted. And so it was dismissed once, and she brought it back again. And of course, here as a board member, I thought, well, that was consultation between her and her stylist, but no regs had been broken there. So I just felt like that was nothing that should ever come before our board. So just a lot of situations like that. But it's I hope that every board member at some time will have that opportunity.
All right, thank you. So I think I'm going to just open this up, and you can answer it as you wish for this next one. So thinking about when you've served as chair, what do you find to be the biggest challenge in running the meeting?
Well, for me, if there has been any change from what we receive in the packet to the board meeting, just trying to keep track of the cases, that have been added or subtracted between that time. And sometimes even though we're given a script to follow, sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. So, but those are my two things.
Yeah, I agree with Ms. LaPierre on those. But also, I found many times in chairing, especially if you have a new board, and once you have someone who comes to defend their case, and so often there's tears and sad stories, and so often then the board members just are intimidated by that. And I will sit there and say, I need a motion on this, and they're all afraid to move. So and the longer you're on the board, you realize then that you vote your conscience, and you not bothered by whether the person's present or not. But I've always found that a big challenge in chairing.
Yeah.
And Mr. Roberts, do you have anything to add? You've very recently had some chairing experiences.
Virtual at that. Again, I would agree with both Ms. LaPierre and Mr. Quisenberry. It's all about the order of the business before the board, and just making sure that the board members that are voting understand the motions that are being made or that need to be made, and And again, making sure that they are voting, their vote, not the vote of the board. And that's one of the things I think is important too, is as a board member, you are not somebody who's being guided or followed. You are making your vote based on your best information, and that's how you should vote. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be swayed by people that come before the board, because you do need to take into account what they do speak on their behalf before the board. But you do need to vote as your individual vote and not the way the board votes.
Thank you. So this next one, I'll go ahead and open up again, and I'll let you decide if you want to answer, because this is a kind of an awkward question. How do you handle your fellow board members who may want to discuss board business outside of a publicly noticed meeting?
Well, I can say that being in the southwest part of Virginia, I don't really run into that. I only see the board members at the meeting, and although I like all of them, they're professional friends, but we just normally have no, interaction in between. And if I ever do with Mr. Roberts, it's always concerning Skills USA or something like that, never with any board business. So that has never been a problem for me.
I would agree with Mr. Quisenberry. I've not had that problem either, even though, there are quite a few of us that are right here in the city. But if I ever feel that I'm approached by a board member in regards to a case that's on the agenda that's coming before us, and they're trying to maybe coerce me into making a, vote a certain way, then of course I would bring that to you, Mr. Kirshner. But other than I've not had that problem.
And that's really the easiest thing, once you do go through the training and you understand the importance of not having those conversations outside of the board meeting setting, and you are having a conversation with another board member, you just need to make sure that at any point, if it does cross into information or conversation about board business, just got to say up, we need to wait to discuss that at the board meeting. But it's fine to have conversation with other board members, just not about board business.
All right, yeah, thank you. So at this point, I'd like to just take a moment and allow the new board members who are present to ask any questions they may have to our experienced panel. So no question. You all have done a great job of answering all the questions that they could have thought of. I do want to thank you. I guess I'll give you an opportunity. Just any other thoughts, anything else you'd like to share with the new board members?
Mm-hmm. I would just like to say that as a new board member, I think that most board members seek that position. It's not that someone knocks on the door and says, would you be a board member? So if you're going to be a board member, give it 100%. Give the time to know the business of the board, the cases, and then your attention throughout the meeting, and just be the professional that I think the public expects to see in the board meeting.
I agree with Mr. Quisenberry 100%. And once you get on the board, then get involved in the subcommittees, because sometimes getting involved in the subcommittees really helps you understand a little bit more about what goes on with the regulations. Because sometimes we have to nitpick the regulations apart for specific things, and getting involved on those subcommittees is really important.
Yes, I agree. I agree with LaPierre and Mr. Quisenberry 100% as well. And just to reiterate what Mr. Quisenberry said earlier is, as a board member, it's your responsibility to give back to your industry. Yes. And so when you are doing anything with the board, keep that in mind, that there are many people affected by what you do, or could be affected by what you're getting ready to do. And, so this is, it's not only a way for you to give back, but it is a heavy responsibility with all of the license holders in the state, both individual and business. And so it's something that, you know, you should take as serious as your career and as, you know, whatever your employment is, because lots of people, lots of lives depend on it.
All right, well, thank you very much. Just wonderful words of wisdom and just the perspectives were great. So thank you all for participating in this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good day, everyone. Bye.
Well, for those of you who are present, did you have any other questions or items that you wanted to discuss, talk about in more detail, anything like that?
We were scheduled for the.
No, it's canceled.
It was canceled.
That was canceled.
That's outright canceled or rescheduled.
Outright canceled.
Yep.
Kathy sent an email.
Okay, I must have missed that.
There's one in August, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's correct. So the April meeting was canceled. And just so that you know why that happened. The law that authorizes the boards to conduct their meetings virtually is very specific about how that happens. And it essentially says the board virtually if it needs to conduct business related to the state of emergency. So the board can't really consider just any business item that it wants during electronically. So we're able to do meetings to do cases because those are necessary. They have to be dealt with according to the APA. And if there were a policy item that was necessary to consider during the pandemic, we could meet electronically to do that. Otherwise, we have to meet in person. And for this board, because there are 15 members, plus staff that have to be involved in the meetings, we didn't feel that there was a safe way to do that during the pandemic, to get that many people into one place. So that's what we didn't have the authority to meet virtually or the space to meet safely in person, and that's what led to it. But we do anticipate in August that we will be able to meet those requirements. We actually have enough time that we can find space that would fit the board safely. Yeah.
The chair and vice chair positions, how are they selected and what is the term length?
So there is a board policy that governs that, and the board or the chair and vice chair positions are essentially one-year positions. The policy says that, and I can't remember if it specifically says 1 year, but it essentially says it'll be voted on after. Sorry, I'm remembering now. For Barber Cosmo, it's 1 year, but it's voted on after new board members are appointed. For HAZOPT, it's 1 year. One of the positions has to be a hearing aid specialist or and the other position has to be optician, and it has to switch every time. So the pandemic has disrupted that because the election is not necessary. So our current board chair is hearing aid specialist. Our vice chair is an optician. At the next in-person meeting, we will have an election, and if that will switch. So the chair will be an optician member, and the vice chair hearing aid specialist. Hopefully that was clear. Any other questions? All right, well, if not, then we will adjourn the meeting. And again, we do thank you for taking the time to come down, and we really hope that this was beneficial. You learned a little bit more about the position. And if you do have any other questions, please